Hey guys, tonight we're drifting far back into the warm sands of ancient Egypt, where the night settles over a desert that has barely changed in 5,000 years, and where the moon floats quietly above the silhouettes of the Great Pyramids. Just breathe slowly, let the day soften, and let's take a calm walk through one of history's biggest mysteries. Not the dramatic version, not the movie version, but the quiet, steady, real, engineer's version of how human hands and human minds actually raised these giants of stone. You can picture the desert before sunrise, the air still cool, almost tender, the sand smooth except for the gentle marks left by wooden sleds dragged the day before. A faint glow is rising behind the eastern horizon, the same direction the Egyptians associated with rebirth, with beginnings, with the calm cycle of life continuing. And as that light spreads, it catches the enormous limestone blocks so perfectly cut that even now they seem unreal, that are waiting in rows, like sleepy guardians who know their turn is coming. The ancient engineers stood there too, just as quietly. Their linen robes fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. Their tools were simple: ropes, levers, sleds, water, wooden shims, copper chisels. Nothing magical, nothing impossible. And yet they were about to shape one of the greatest structures the world would ever see. The overseer would walk along the line, checking plumb lines made of string and stones, verifying angles with wooden squares, testing the smoothness of freshly cut faces. And all of it was done slowly, methodically, with the kind of patience that only civilizations with eternity on their mind could possess. The workers began early, thousands of them, but not slaves. Not the broken people of exaggerated legends, rather seasonal workers, craftsmen, farmers, who came when the Nile flooded their fields. They ate bread, onions, figs, and fresh fish. They slept in organized villages. They worked in rotating crews, not forced, but proud, because building a pyramid wasn't just labor. It was service to eternity, a way to earn honor, food, wages, and a place in a story bigger than themselves. The sound of copper chisels tapping against limestone filled the morning air. Not loud, more like a soft rhythm, hundreds of taps blending into a single, calming pulse. Craftsmen shaped each block by eye, by instinct, by knowing the feel of stone. They sprinkled water to reduce dust. They checked each edge with simple cord-based measurements, and the block slowly transformed from rough rock into a clean, pale geometric shape that would fit into the great body of the pyramid, like a bone into a living creature. The transportation was slow, but peaceful. A team would come forward, tie thick ropes around the block, position it onto a wide wooden sled, and prepare the sand path ahead. They didn't drag stones over dry sand, not if they could help it. They poured water gently, turning the surface into a smooth, compact layer that reduced friction almost by half. The sled glided, not effortlessly, but steadily, the way something moves when many hands pull in unison. You can imagine the sound: soft sliding, strained ropes, boots pressing into the sand, and the deep breath of workers pacing themselves like a slow heartbeat. As the block reached the ramp, the engineers examined the alignment. The pyramid wasn't built with guesswork. The base was leveled so perfectly that modern lasers barely beat it. They used simple water trenches to check the level. Wherever water pooled evenly, they knew the ground was true. The corners were aligned with the stars, especially the north, where the circumpolar constellations rotated like eternal guardians. With strings, with patience, with sight alone, they locked the pyramid into cosmic precision. A quiet murmur moved through the morning village as workers took sips of water, wiped sweat, and prepared for the lifting phase. Ramps weren't giant spirals stretching to the sky. They were small, practical, earth and stone ramps that grew with the pyramid. As soon as a layer was finished, they built a small new ramp to the next level, step by step, layer by layer. In engineering terms, the pyramid grew like a rising staircase, not a massive slope. The block was moved up the ramp slowly, pausing often. Workers adjusted the angle, used wooden levers to lift one side, placed shims underneath, and inched the stone upward. Nothing sudden, nothing forced, just many small, patient movements that eventually added up to something impossible-looking. At the top of the current layer, the block met a flat surface of already placed stones. These stones were so perfectly smoothed and aligned that the new block almost knew where to go. The crew used a simple technique. One worker poured a thin line of wet gypsum plaster. Another guided the block, and several men tapped gently with wooden mallets until the stone slid into its final resting place. The moment it truly fit, the sound changed. A soft, satisfying thud echoed across the plateau, carrying with it a sense of completion, precision, and craft. And as each block settled into position, the pyramid grew heavier, more stable, more rooted into the earth. The workers saw it rise day by day, like watching a mountain being born. Their routines never rushed. Everything flowed like the slow rhythm of the Nile itself. The sun had fully risen by now, pouring warm golden light over the Giza plateau. The pyramids caught the light beautifully, their original polished casing stones shining like mirrors, reflecting the sunrise so brightly that from miles away they must have looked like enormous beams of frozen sunlight. And through that glow, the engineers walked in calm satisfaction, noting progress, adjusting plans, preparing for another day of steady creation. The workers returned to their tools, the tapping resumed, and the pyramid continued its slow, steady climb toward the sky. Everything quiet, everything patient, everything human. The day moved forward gently. The kind of warm Egyptian day where the sun spreads slowly across the stone and makes every surface glow with a soft, sleepy brightness. The workers' village behind the construction site began to hum with its quiet routines. The smell of fresh bread rising from clay ovens, the low chatter of people preparing midday meals, the faint sounds of animals shifting lazily in the shade. Everything was ordinary, grounded, alive, nothing dramatic. Just the calm heartbeat of a civilization working together at a pace carved by nature. Near the base of the pyramid, a group of young apprentices gathered around an older engineer who carried a bundle of thin wooden rods and cords. His voice was steady and gentle as he explained the day's measurements. He placed a rod into the sand, tied a cord to its top, and stretched the line toward a distant point marked by another stake. The apprentices watched closely as he checked the angle with a simple square, then adjusted it slightly, just a breath to the left, letting the cord fall perfectly straight. This was the secret. He told them, not strength, not magic, not giants of stone who moved blocks with impossible force. The secret was alignment, patience, repetition, thousands of tiny adjustments that, over time, created precision so perfect that even future ages with advanced tools would wonder how it was done. The apprentices nodded softly, almost mesmerized by the slow ritual of line, angle, shadow, and sun. The old engineer smiled. He had seen this look before, the quiet wonder that blooms when someone realizes that great things are built, not in moments of glory but in countless quiet minutes, each one tied carefully to the next. As the sun climbed higher, the workers paused for rest. They found shade under linen awnings stretched between wooden poles. Some leaned back on baskets of ropes. Some drank cool water stored in clay jars. A few simply closed their eyes, letting the desert breeze wash over them, breathing deeply, slowly, sinking with the stillness around them. In that calm moment, you can almost hear the Egypt of 5,000 years ago breathing alongside you, the soft rustle of palm leaves, the distant call of herders guiding goats along the Nile's edge, the distant murmur of river water flowing past reeds that sway like sleepy whisperers of ancient stories. And still, even in rest, the pyramid remained alive. Its layers were visible, like steps of time. The blocks fit so precisely that thin shadows formed between them, cool lines that almost looked like brushstrokes painted by the sun. Every layer told a story. Here is where a team worked through late afternoon heat. Here is where a stone was polished smoother than expected. Here is where an apprentice placed his first block with trembling pride. Later, as work resumed, a new group prepared to move one of the heaviest stones of the day. The overseer stood at the front, his hand lifted, waiting for silence. When the moment felt right, he lowered his hands slowly. Dozens of men leaned forward together, gripping thick ropes wrapped in leather for protection. Their movements were synchronized, like a well-rehearsed dance. The sled began to slide, inch by inch, over the dampened sand. The engineer walked beside them, his eyes scanning for any sign of strain rope tension, sand resistance, angle of approach. He knew every detail mattered. A slight dip in the sand could tilt the block. A dry patch could slow it. A sudden jolt could crack an edge. And so he guided them with gentle gestures, raising his hand when they needed to pause, circling his finger when they needed to angle the sled slightly left or right. The block reached the ramp and paused again. Workers placed thick wooden rollers under the sled, not to roll the block but to ease friction for the first lift. They positioned levers, strategically long wooden beams wedged under the sled's frame. With a slow count, they pressed down, and the block lifted just enough for shims to slide underneath. Slow movements, small rises, gentle lifts, nothing hurried. With each step, the block ascended a little more. The sun cast long shadows across the ramp, as if it too was participating in the day's work. Stretching and shifting with every lift, the rhythm of teamwork continued. Push, pause, adjust, breathe, and always, the engineers watched with quiet focus, predicting every motion before it happened. As the block reached the new layer, the workers let out a collective breath. Not a shout, not a cheer, just a long, steady exhale. They were proud, but their pride flowed quietly, the way the Nile flowed, never rushing, always moving forward. The stone was guided into position, a thin layer of gypsum smoothing its landing. Wooden mallets tapped gently, tap, 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 until the block settled with its familiar soft thud, becoming part of the pyramid's growing body. And then, for a moment, everything stilled. The workers stood back, wiping their foreheads, looking at the result of their patience. The overseer nodded, the engineers nodded, the apprentices stared with wonder, and the pyramid, silent and steady, accepted its newest piece. As the warm Egyptian afternoon slid slowly toward evening, the light began to soften across the Giza plateau until everything seemed to glow from within, as if the stones themselves had stored sunlight in their ancient bodies. The workers moved with a slower rhythm now, not from exhaustion alone, but because the world around them was gently winding down. The desert cooling step by step, the breeze turning from warm to mild, to something almost silky. The long shadows of the pyramid stretched across the sand in quiet angles, like the hands of some giant sundial marking time in a language older than writing. Metallic taps of hammers softened, ropes loosened, creaks of wooden sleds faded. The workers gathered their tools, each man knowing exactly where every chisel and lever belonged, placing them carefully into baskets or wrapping them in linen to protect their edges from grit. The apprentices hurried to assist, though even their movements felt slower now, almost lulled by the calm pulse of evening. The engineers moved among them, offering nods, words of mild approval, or small corrections for the next day. Nothing harsh, nothing rushed, just a smooth continuation of a craft that had been passed down from father to son, from master to student, for generations. In the village nearby, fires were being lit. Clay ovens glowed softly as bread baked inside. The smell drifted out into the dusk-warm grain. Roasted onion, a faint sweetness of dates boiling in pots. Workers returning from the site peeled off their headcloths, washed their faces and arms with cool water carried from the Nile, and sat in small circles talking in low tones. Some spoke of family, some of the work ahead tomorrow. Some simply stared at the fading sky, as if absorbing the colors would give their bodies rest. The Egyptian evening was a gentle thing. Birds crossed the sky in long arcs. The desert foxes began to stir, tiny prints forming near the edges of the workers' village. Camels snorted softly, shifting their weight on the sand. From the distance, the Nile shimmered, reflecting the last fragments of daylight like ripples of liquid gold. But even as the sight settled, the engineers still had their quiet tasks. A small group climbed a gentle rise not far from the pyramid, carrying nothing but cords, measuring rods, and a clay bowl filled with oil. They crouched at the top and began to test the alignment of the day's work. One engineer placed a rod upright. Another tied a long cord to its top and lined it with the faint, emerging North Star. Even as the star twinkled softly in the deepening blue sky, the engineers whispered to one another, adjusting the cord by fractions so small that most eyes would never notice. But these men saw them instantly. This was how the pyramid stayed aligned with cosmic precision. Every day, small verifications, small corrections, small agreements with the sky. The workers below knew what these engineers were doing, but they never disturbed them. They respected the quiet nightly ritual. The alignment wasn't superstition, it was engineering, wrapped in the spiritual language of the time. For Egyptians, the northern stars never set. They circled endlessly, and so they symbolized eternity. Aligning the pyramid to those stars meant aligning the pharaoh's resting place with the cycle of eternal life. As the stars brightened overhead, one by one like grains of salt scattered across dark silk, the engineers dipped a small reed in oil. They placed it inside the clay bowl and set it alight. The flame rose steady and clean, with almost no flicker. They used its unwavering glow to test whether the ground was perfectly still. Just as they would use water during the day, the flame stayed calm, not a tremble. It meant the alignment was perfect, the foundation stable, the day's work true. Only when they were satisfied did the engineers rise, stretching their backs, rolling up the cords, and walking back toward the village. Their footsteps were almost silent on the cool sand. The pyramid loomed behind them, each of its rising layers dimly lit by starlight, the edges sharp even in darkness. It didn't yet look like the smooth-sided monument we imagine today, since its outer casing was still incomplete. But even in this stepped form, it felt enormous, immovable, patient. Inside the workers' village, lamps glowed behind linen curtains. People sat around small fires, eating quietly. Conversations drifted like gentle breezes. A few men played simple reed flutes, filling the night with low, haunting melodies that seemed to echo the desert's own endless sigh. Some workers stretched out on mats, closing their eyes, letting the warmth of the fire settle into their bones. A few talked with soft pride about how many blocks their team had set today. Others, especially the younger apprentices, could not help but glance repeatedly toward the pyramid, as if still unable to believe they were part of something so enormous, something that would outlive them by thousands of years. And then, as night deepened further, the voices dimmed, the crackling of fires softened, the flutes paused. The world seemed to hold its breath for a moment. The plateau grew still in a way only deserts can, vast, open, and quiet enough to hear your own pulse. In this calm, the master builder himself walked a final slow circle around the base of the pyramid. His linen robe fluttered gently around his legs. He ran his fingers along the cool edges of the stone, feeling the precision his workers had achieved today. He murmured a few words to the gods, not pleading, but thanking them for strength, for harmony, for the peaceful continuation of the project. Then he looked upward, toward the scattering of stars overhead, and breathed deeply. Tomorrow, he knew they would continue the same cycle: cut, shape, transport, lift, align, fit. 1,000 small motions repeating until they became a structure of impossible magnitude. But to him, there was no impossibility in it, only patience. He walked back to his tent, leaving behind the immense silhouette of the pyramid as it rose silently into the night sky. Hours passed, the desert cooled further. A faint mist settled near the Nile. Workers and engineers slept under the twinkling stars, their chests rising and falling in slow harmony with the night breeze. Even the animals slept more deeply on nights like this, when the air held a perfect stillness. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon, the desert was already awake in its own quiet way. A soft pale light began creeping across the sand, turning the distant river into a long silver thread. The sky shifted from deep blue to gentle lavender, then to a warm rose color that made everything look alive again. The village stirred. A few workers stepped out early, stretching their arms, rubbing their eyes, yawning softly. They checked the bread baking in ovens, prepared water pots, tightened ropes, examined tools, and woke the younger boys who always tried to steal a few extra minutes of sleep under their linen blankets. Farther off, a small group of strong men approached the quarry. They carried chisels and wooden mallets, ready to begin shaping the next set of blocks. The quarry was busy even before the sun fully rose, because stone cutting was easier in the cool hours. The rocks gleamed faintly in the morning light, their pale surfaces still cold from the night. Craftsmen ran their fingers over the stone, feeling for natural lines, the faintest cracks, the subtle grain. They knew exactly where to strike. The first tap echoed across the plateau, soft, rhythmic, confident, then another, then many more. Soon, the peaceful morning filled with the calm melody of work beginning again. At the construction site, engineers gathered new measurements. They ran cords across the fresh layer placed yesterday, checking every line, every edge, every slope. They waited for the sun to rise fully, so that shadows would form sharp and clear across the stone, helping them see imperfections. They marked tiny corrections with red ochre, instructing workers where to smooth, where to adjust, where to place the first stone of the day. And once the sun was warm and bright, the steady movement of workers began again, pulling ropes, pushing sleds, pouring water to wet the sand path. The new day felt almost like a continuation of yesterday, as if time itself had smoothed the boundary between one and the next. The desert wind carried the scent of sunlight on limestone. The workers felt it on their skin, a warmth that didn't burn yet but promised to grow stronger. They pulled in unison, leaning forward, their muscles working together like parts of a single living machine. The block moved slowly, inching across the prepared path, toward the ramp. Nearby, a group of younger boys carried jars of water back and forth, pouring it carefully in small streams ahead of the sled. Their faces were serious, determined. This was an important job. Too much water, the sand turned to mud. Too little water, friction increased. They had to feel the sand with their feet, sense its texture, and pour exactly the right amount. The block reached the ramp's base. Workers placed short wooden rollers under the sled. It wasn't too roll just to reduce the initial friction for the first lift. They positioned levers strategically, long beams wedged under the sled's frame. The overseer raised his hand and called for silence. A breath passed through the group, then another. The overseer dropped his hand, and the lifting began. The first rise was small, barely noticeable, but the sled shifted upward, resting on the rollers. Workers pushed from behind, leaning with all their weight. Others pulled from the front, guiding the motion. Slowly, gradually, step by step, the block ascended. As it rose higher, the desert sunlight struck it at a soft angle, making its sharp edges glow. The wind brushed past the workers' faces, carrying with it the faint rustle of linen, the smell of dust, the sound of distant hammering from the quarry. The block hovered near the upper edge of the ramp, resting on its wooden supports for a brief pause, as the workers let their breath settle into the warm desert air. A thin shimmer rose from the sand, a delicate wavering that made the entire world look like it was gently melting into dreamlike ripples. The workers prepared for the final push to slide the stone into its position on the new layer. The overseer lifted a hand again, and the men tightened their grips on the ropes. Even the apprentices leaned forward, eyes wide, wanting to memorize every motion of this final stage, the quiet ritual that turned a loose block into a permanent part of the pyramid. The ropes stretched, the wood creaked softly, and the block shifted just enough to begin its journey across the flat surface of the new layer. A layer that had been checked with cords and plumb lines at sunrise. A layer that carried the faint streaks of red ochre marking where the stone needed to land, where its edges would meet its neighbors with a precise and satisfying fit. The workers guided it carefully, left a little, stop, straighten the angle, push forward, adjust the rear corner, and then, as the block slid across the gypsum plaster spread moments before, it settled into its tiny resting void. The mallets came next, soft taps, gentle taps, rhythmic taps, a sound as calming as a heartbeat. The stone shifted a final few grains worth into its place. A new part of the pyramid skeleton taking its permanent shape. As soon as the block was secure, the energy around the workers changed. Lightness replaced strain. Voices rose softly again, and the weight of effort melted away. Some men smiled, others drank water. A few simply placed a hand on the stone for a moment, as if acknowledging that they had shaped something that would last far beyond their lifetimes. And then, just like that, it was time for the next one. Down below, the path from the quarry shimmered with heat. The sled for the next block waited, half-shadowed by a linen awning tied between two poles. The younger apprentices inspected the ropes again, making sure no strand was frayed or weak. They pulled each rope through their hands, feeling for any softness or roughness that might compromise the pull. Older craftsmen checked the sled's wooden base, tightening its bindings, replacing a worn plank with a new one cut last night under lamplight. Everything was maintained with care, because every piece of equipment, the sled, the ropes, the levers, had to survive months, years of use. A broken tool meant delays, and delays meant misalignment, and misalignment meant the entire pyramid could lose its perfect geometry. So they were meticulous, patient, devoted. Near the quarry, a fresh block was being shaped. The limestone face glowed pale under the rising sun. Craftsmen circled it like bees around a hive. One man tapped at a natural crack, listening to the hollow echo beneath the surface. Another brushed chalk across a line where the next cut needed to be made. Copper chisels clicked and clinked in steady repetition. Each strike removed only a thin sliver, but each sliver was part of the grand shape. Dust swirled around their feet in soft clouds. They weren't carving random shapes. They carved with a geometric purpose. The blocks needed to match precise angles, precise lengths, precise faces, because each layer of the pyramid had to be slightly different, slightly narrower, slightly angled. The craftsmen understood the geometry not with numbers on parchment, but with instinct, with repetition, with the kind of bodily knowledge gained from years of shaping stone. As they worked, small chips of limestone fell into little piles at their feet, looking like tiny ivory flakes. A breeze carried some of them toward the plateau. Light filtered through the dust, turning the air pearly white for a moment, before the breeze shifted again and the dust settled on the sand. By the time the stone was ready for transport, its edges had been softened, its surfaces smoothed, its corners squared. 2 workers brushed water across the stone's surface to cool it and reduce dust. Then, with practiced precision, the team placed wooden rods underneath it, levered the block upward, slid the sled beneath, and tied the ropes securely. The second block of the day began its journey. The workers pulled, leaning forward in unison. Their feet dug into the sand, and their bodies swayed with the rhythm of slow strength. The apprentices ran ahead, pouring water in thin streams across the sand path, their hands steady despite the weight of the jars. Step by step, the block moved forward, the sled gliding over dampened sand. The desert wind brushed past their backs, carrying the faint scent of the Nile and the promise of cooler evening hours. The distant hum of quarry work blended with the creak of the sled and the soft grunt of effort, creating the quiet music of labor that had echoed across this land for generations. As they neared the ramp, the sun rose higher, bathing the stones and workers in a warm, bright light. The surface of the pyramid almost shimmered now, each layer catching sunlight at a different angle, creating a mosaic of glowing surfaces. The desert looked endless beyond it, an ocean of gold stretching toward the horizon. At the ramp, the routine repeated: rollers, levers, coordinated pulling, coordinated pushing. The stone rose, inch by inch, the workers' breaths sinking with each lift. They paused at intervals, letting muscles relax, letting the ropes cool in the air before gripping them again. The overseer walked alongside them silently, offering small nods, keenly observing each change in tension. Up it went, higher, slowly, safely. The desert watched as the block reached the top, and once again, it slid into position on the new layer. 1 block at a time, the pyramid climbed. By midday, the workers rested under stretched linen sheets that filtered the sun into soft white light. They ate bread dipped in date paste, drank cool water from clay jars, and stretched their backs on woven mats. Some lay down completely, dozing off almost instantly. Others talked in low tones about their families, their farms, their hopes. Not ordinary hopes, hopes tied to the idea that the pyramid they were building would stand for eternity. They believed that helping build the pharaoh's resting place earned them connection to eternity too. That each stone placed was like placing a stone inside their own legacy. So even though the work was hard, there was pride in every breath, every step, every muscle strained. When the rest ended, the sun was slightly lower, the light turning warmer again. Work resumed with the same rhythm of patience. More blocks came, more lifts, more taps of mallets, more nods from overseers. The afternoon moved slowly, gently, as if time itself had softened. Shadows began stretching across the plateau earlier than expected, since the pyramid was now tall enough to cast shade far across the ground. Workers welcomed these cool shadows whenever they passed through them. Shade felt like a blessing in a land where sunlight reigned supreme. And somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, something quiet and beautiful happened. A breeze came from the west, steady and cool. It carried the scent of distant marshes and palm trees. The workers felt it touch their skin, and many paused for a moment, closing their eyes, letting the breeze wrap around them like a soft cloth. Even the overseer lifted his face slightly, embracing that momentary gift of nature. The desert rarely gave comfort, but when it did, everyone felt it deeply. By late afternoon, the sound of chisels from the quarry had faded, the cutters working in shifts. The pyramid site grew quieter too, with fewer stones needing placement in the remaining daylight. The engineers spent this time doing careful adjustments, smoothing tiny ridges, shaving off imperfections, ensuring the new layer matched the blueprint etched into their minds. As the sun dipped lower, turning the sky into a warm gradient of gold and rose, the workers placed the final stone of the day. The mallets tapped, the block settled, a soft thud echoed gently, and just like that, another layer was complete. The workers stepped back. They looked up at the pyramid rising above them, now taller, grander, closer to the sky than ever before. The top wasn't even visible from the ground anymore, without stepping far back. A few men did exactly that, walking several paces away just to admire what they'd created. Pride filled their chests, simple, quiet pride. As the sky deepened into evening, the workers packed their tools again. They brushed dust from their clothes. They wrapped the ropes and stacked the shims. The overseer gave a soft signal, not a command, but a gentle indication that the day's tasks were complete. The village awaited them. Warm food, cool water, soft cloth beds. The evening breeze promised comfort. Lamps were already flickering behind linen curtains. The desert foxes were already exploring the edges of the plateau. And as the workers walked back, tired yet peaceful, the pyramid stood behind them like a massive, sleeping giant, one that had grown a little taller today, a little more complete, a little closer to the eternal shape it was destined to become. The night settled again over the sands. Stars blinked awake. The Nile reflected their shimmering patterns. The workers drifted into sleep. Tomorrow, they would return. Tomorrow, they would rise again. Tomorrow, the pyramid would grow. One block at a time. One breath at a time. One patient sunrise after another. The first light of morning drifted across the wide plateau as the workers walked closer, and the pyramid's half-finished face caught that pale gold glow so softly that it seemed less like a structure and more like a mountain, remembering it had once been part of the earth. The air still held the coolness of night, the kind that disappears quickly in Egypt. But for this fragile moment, the desert was gentle. Sand made the faintest hush under their feet, and the workers, still quiet with sleep, moved almost like shadows returning to their places. And in that slow, quiet moment, the engineer you have been following, this calm, careful mind wandering through the centuries, continued to observe everything with a kind of peaceful precision. He watched the way the workers folded into their routines, how they greeted the day not with rush or command, but with a patient familiarity, as though the pyramid had always been part of their lives, and in a way, it had. Many of them had been here since the first foundation trench was cut into the bedrock. They had watched the pyramid rise layer by layer, year by year, like a sunrise that never stopped. What struck him most wasn't the scale of it, or the math behind it, or even the incredible organization required. It was the slowness, the grace of repetition, the way thousands of hands, morning after morning, quietly shaped a monument intended to endure forever. Nothing rushed here, nothing chaotic. Everything was steady, almost meditative, as if the entire project was built on breath rather than force. He paused near the great shadow the pyramid cast on the sand. Even half-built, the shadow felt ancient, stretching across the ground like a dark pool of time. He stepped into it, letting the shade cool his skin. The workers moved past him, lifting ropes, preparing sledges, checking the wooden rollers and stone tracks they had set the previous evening. The smell of dampened sand drifted by someone had sprinkled water to reduce friction for the hauling teams. It was one of the many small, practical tricks that made the impossible seem effortless. A gentle breeze rolled across the plateau, stirring tiny grains of sand that shimmered in the light. He closed his eyes for a moment and imagined what this scene would look like thousands of years later. Visitors from across the world, cameras in hand, wondering how such a thing was ever possible. They would imagine whips and slaves, impossible cruelty and desperate labor. But not this calmness, this rhythm, this cooperation that felt almost like a prayer performed with bodies instead of words. When he opened his eyes again, the first stone block of the day was being prepared. The block was as massive as people imagined, the absurd multi-ton monsters that storytellers love to exaggerate. It weighed maybe 2.5 tons, shaped smooth and square with copper tools, sharpened countless times. The workers tied thick woven ropes around it, sliding wooden runners beneath. 2 men checked the ropes with practiced fingers, tugging them gently, not with suspicion but with affection, like farmers checking harnesses on well-loved animals before a calm day in the fields. The engineer slowly walked toward them, but he did not speak. He didn't need to. The scene explained itself if you simply watched closely enough. A foreman stepped forward, not shouting, not clapping, simply lifting his hand. The hauling team lined up, the rope resting across their shoulders, the sand around their feet already dampened to reduce resistance. They took a single breath together, a slow inhale that seemed to pull the whole morning into their lungs, and then they leaned forward in perfect unison. The block moved, not with violence, not with straining muscles or desperate struggling. It moved like a heavy boat pushing off from a quiet shore, gliding with steady pressure. Their feet shuffled softly over the earth, their sandals brushing the sand with the sound of cloth sliding over fabric. The ropes creaked rhythmically, like a deep old harp hum. The block glided forward along the wooden runners, guided by men who looked more like dancers than laborers. Step by step, inch by inch, the block approached the ramp. The engineer followed beside them, keeping pace. The ramp rose gently, not the steep, dramatic ramps popular in modern imagination, but a long, gradual slope, broad enough for dozens of workers to maneuver comfortably. Each step of the ramp was packed with limestone chips, gravel, and mud, forming a stable pathway that had been rebuilt and reshaped countless times. As the block reached the base of the ramp, 2 crews waited, one to adjust the runners, another to guide the stone up the incline. The team pulling the rope leaned slightly forward, ready to continue. The foreman lowered his hand again. The block began its ascent. The climb was long, but the movement was smooth. Men sprinkled more water as needed, and others used wooden levers to correct the block's angle. The pyramid grew larger beside them, the limestone face glowing like warm ivory, and the sky above stretched wide and endlessly blue. Halfway up the ramp, the engineer paused and looked around. Everywhere he turned, there were details. Simple, human details that explained everything better than any theory or documentary ever could. A man adjusting a rope, not with calloused fingers, another passing a cup of water along the line. A child, probably the son of a worker running errands, with a woven basket of rope wedges. Women preparing cool jugs of beer-bred drink in the nearby village. Overseers making notes on wooden tablets, not with threats but with steady, professional focus. It was a society at work, a community, a living rhythm, and he felt the quiet realization settle into his mind. They didn't build the pyramids despite being human. They built them because they were human, capable of patience, coordination, repetition, and purpose. As he watched the block reach the next platform level, he felt a faint warmth in his chest. Not admiration for some ancient genius, nor marvel at impossible engineering, but a soft understanding. These people didn't see the pyramid as a miracle. They saw it as work, meaningful work, steady work, proud work. They trusted their process. They trusted time. They trusted each other. The workers carefully turned the block into position, maneuvering it with wooden levers. The stone met its place with a soft thud, not a dramatic crash. Dust rose in a thin golden sigh that the sunlight caught like a fine veil. 2 masons stepped forward to inspect the alignment, their hands moving gently across the edges, checking flushness with smooth wooden tools. A tiny tap here, a shift there, and the block settled perfectly against its neighbor. Another layer complete, just one among thousands. The engineer let his hand rest on the warm limestone surface. It felt solid, ancient, and yet strangely tender, like the skin of something alive. He imagined the millions of touches that had shaped it, the slow accumulation of human effort embedded in every grain. Behind him, the next block was already making its way up the ramp. He walked slowly along the platform, listening to the soft murmur of work continuing. The sun was rising higher now, warming the air. A distant drumbeat echoed from the workers' village, steady, slow, designed not for speed, but for synchronization. The drumbeat made the work feel almost like a long, serene heartbeat, pulsing across the desert. He wandered toward a shaded shelter set up for scribes and overseers. Wooden planks formed simple benches and tables, and a scribe dipped his reed brush into ink as he marked the day's progress. Another overseer leaned over a drawn measuring grid, scratched onto a thin slab of plaster, studying angles with a calm, calculating expression. These men weren't tyrants. They were professionals, project managers of their age, focused on precision, alignment, and teamwork. The engineer watched them scratch tiny notations into their tablets, check marks, angles, stone counts for the day. All so ordinary, so procedural. And yet these ordinary marks would one day form a monument that defied ages. A breeze brushed through the shelter, lifting dust motes into the air. They danced gently in the sunlight, swirling slowly, settling onto the wooden tables like soft reminders of passing time. He stepped away again, drawn toward the edge of the platform where the desert stretched far into the horizon. Below, the workers' village lay quiet and structured, with rows of simple homes built from mud brick. Smoke rose lazily from hearths where morning meals were being cooked. Families moved through open courtyards, preparing bread, repairing tools, beginning their day with the same rhythm as those on the plateau. He felt a strange calm watching it all unfold. So many lives connected through this single project. So many days, layered like the stones themselves, building not just a pyramid, but a sense of purpose, community, and continuity. He turned again toward the pyramid and watched another team approach with a fresh block. The cycle repeated: ropes, sledges, runners, water, breath, unity, and with each repetition, the pyramid grew a little taller, a little more complete, a little closer to the sky. The engineer closed his eyes and let the slow, warm air settle over him. The sounds of the workers faded into a rhythmic hum. The sunlight pressed gently against his skin. The ramp loomed like a path into the heavens, and he thought, in a quiet moment of understanding, this is how they built it. Not with mystery, not with miracles, but with patience, with thousands of calm mornings, with hands that trusted the stone, and feet that trusted the path beneath them, with time itself. And as he let that thought settle, the wind shifted softly, carrying with it the faint scent of fresh-cut limestone from the masons above. The day continued, the workers continued, and the pyramid, stone by stone, rose slowly toward the sky. The wind shifted again, a soft desert sigh moving across the plateau, carrying that pale, chalky scent of freshly cut limestone sharp at the edges, but softened by distance and morning warmth. It drifted through the air like a quiet reminder of how many stones had already been shaped, how many more waited in the quarries beyond the horizon. The workers barely reacted to the smell. To them it was simply part of the day, as familiar as the sand beneath their feet or the sun slowly climbing into the sky. The engineer opened his eyes and let his focus return to the structure rising in front of him. The pyramid caught the sunlight with a growing brilliance. Every block added to the face changed its geometry, changing how shadows fell, how light scattered, how heat built during the afternoon. Even the scent of limestone matted freshly cut stone was softer, easier to work, easier to position with perfect precision before it hardened over months and years. A team of masons was already preparing the next surface. They knelt along the edge of the latest course, marking tiny reference lines using a mixture of red ochre and water. Each mark mattered. Nothing on the pyramid was guessed. Every alignment was calculated, checked, and checked again. And that was exactly where the engineer's mind went into the quiet mathematics behind the calm routine. He walked along the edge of the platform, tracing the faint lines that guided the masons. The lines formed a grid subtle, almost invisible, unless the sun struck them at the right angle. It reminded him of modern construction chalk lines, the kind builders snap across concrete slabs. But these were painted by hand, repeated hundreds of times, adjusted as necessary. The grid ensured that each block sat precisely where it belonged. No drifting rows, no cumulative error. Every stone was a part of a vast, subtle geometry. He watched a pair of workers carry a long wooden stretcherjan, early form of a leveling tool. Wooden wedges and sighting strings dangled from it. They placed the straight edge over a newly set block, peering along its length to ensure perfect alignment with its neighbors. One worker gently tapped a corner with a wooden mallet. The sound, a soft, resonant thud. The block shifted by perhaps the width of a grain of sand. That was all it needed. Perfection, he thought. Built one almost invisible adjustment at a time. The engineer stepped closer to a corner marker, a small stone set deliberately into the platform edge. To most eyes, it looked like just another block. But it wasn't. It was a reference stone, part of the pyramid's master layout. The builders used these stones like fixed points in a giant coordinate system. Sightlines stretched from one to another, checked by eye, corrected when needed. Without tools made of steel, without lasers, without digital mapping, the Egyptians achieved near-perfect orthogonality so precise that even thousands of years later, modern engineers could only nod in respect. He knelt there for a moment, letting his fingers brush the warm surface of the reference stone. The subtle groove carved across its top caught the sunlight, illuminating the alignment mark. It pointed toward the cardinal directions, not just roughly, but with astonishing accuracy. And as he studied it, he could almost see the ancient surveyors walking across the desert at dusk, setting up sighting poles, measuring shadows, tracking the transit of stars, to ensure the pyramid sat aligned with the north in a way modern cities rarely bother with. Behind him, the steady rhythm of the hauling team continued, a heavy stone sliding along dampened sand, wood creaking beneath it, rope fibers softly singing with tension. The engineer rose and followed the sound, wanting to see the next part of the process more closely. The block the team was pulling now was slightly larger than the previous one, perhaps closer to 3 tons. Its edges were crisp, its faces smoothed with copper chisels that masons sharpened again and again on dolerite pounding stones. The surface still held a faint sheen of moisture from the quarry, where it had been cut while the morning was still cool. But what interested the engineer wasn't just the block, it was the team pulling it. They weren't straining, they weren't shouting, they weren't synchronized through force, but through practice. Each worker leaned into the rope with a slight bend of the knee, their feet digging lightly into the moist sand. The rope was made from thick papyrus fibers, twisted tightly together. It stretched just a little under load, like a natural shock absorber. And the engineer smiled to himself, because he recognized something. The pulling technique was not primitive. It was optimized, efficient, wise. A foreman walked beside them holding a small clay jar. As they paused to adjust grip, he sprinkled a thin line of water directly onto the sand before the wooden runners. Not too much, just enough. Wet sand reduced friction dramatically. Experiments thousands of years later would prove it. The right moisture content could cut the force needed to pull a stone almost in half. And these workers knew it intuitively. The engineer slowed his pace, watching the sledge glide forward with surprising grace. He realized something. The ancient Egyptians may not have had wheels that could handle this terrain, but they understood the physics of friction better than many civilizations that came after. He moved closer to the workers guiding the block. These were specialists, men with strong arms and steady eyes, who used long wooden levers to keep the block aligned on the path. The levers acted as simple machines, multiplying their strength. Even a slight push on a lever could shift the block's direction. He admired how smoothly they worked, adjusting angle without breaking stride. One man would tap the runner, another would tilt the sled, and the entire system behaved like a large, stable organism. As they neared the ramp, the engineer looked up at its construction. The ramp wasn't a single massive incline, but a layered, engineered structure built from limestone debris, mud brick, gravel, and tamped earth. It had been widened and reshaped dozens of times. Along its edges, smaller retaining walls held the fill in place. Wooden beams reinforced specific sections where the incline steepened. Engineers had mapped out every angle, ensuring the gradient was gentle enough for hauling teams, but steep enough to minimize distance. He walked beside the team as they transferred the stone onto a reinforced section. The runners were replaced with thicker wooden beams placed perpendicular to the ramp. As the workers prepared the next phase, the engineer's eyes drifted to the distribution of ropes. 2 long ropes pulled from the front, but additional ropes were attached to the sides and rear. These weren't to assist with pulling, they were to control swing, rotation, and unintended slipping. A simple, elegant solution. The foreman raised his hand, and the ascent began. Step by step, the block climbed. The engineer walked ahead now, examining the structural behavior of the ramp under load. Each footfall compressed the packed earth slightly, but the reinforcing stones beneath kept everything stable. He noticed subtle drainage grooves carved into the sides, allowing water to escape so the ramp never weakened during rare desert rains. Halfway up, he paused beside a worker carrying a basket of limestone chips. The man sprinkled the chips ahead of the block, creating a firmer rolling surface. The engineer pointed softly, murmuring in curiosity, and the worker explained. Gently, chips help distribute pressure, preventing the sledge from sinking too deeply into the ramp surface. Again, simple physics applied with quiet intelligence. The block reached the top of the platform, and the hauling team eased to a stop. The air grew brighter as the sun cleared the horizon fully, illuminating the tier where masons were preparing to set this new stone into its place. To master, masons approached. Their tools were simple. Copper chisels, wooden mallets, smoothing stones, and thin cords coated in red pigment. They inspected the receiving space, brushing away debris with small reeds. One mason adjusted a tiny wedge, perhaps the size of a thumb. The other sighted along a string line stretched between 2 marker stones. Everything had to be exact. The engineer crouched beside them, watching them communicate with soft gestures rather than words. A tap here, a nod, a slight pull on the string. They moved like musicians in a quiet duet, each action responding perfectly to the other. The block was levered into position using wooden beams and rounded stone fulcrums. The masons guided it with their hands, listening to the subtle sounds the stone made as it found its resting place. A faint grind, a settling whisper, a soft thump as it aligned flush with its neighbors. Dust rose and drifted in a pale cloud. The engineer exhaled slowly. This was engineering, not dramatic, not violent, but patient. A long conversation between material, time, and human hands. Above them, higher on the pyramid, he could see workers carving away the rough outer edges of the blocks that would form the final casing layers. Copper chisels flashed in the light as they chipped. Wooden mallets tapped steadily. Each chip fell with the soft patter of stone turning back into dust. He moved toward the inner corridors being shaped. These weren't the dramatic passageways tourists imagine, but narrow, meticulous channels being planned with astonishing foresight. The dimensions were measured with cubit rods, wooden sticks, marked in pommel finger increments. The engineer studied one rod lying nearby. Its edges were polished smooth by years of use. Tiny marks along its length represented subdivisions so precise that modern measurements showed almost no deviation. He imagined the architect Imhotep, or perhaps his successors, designing interior chambers with mathematical ratios, harmonic proportions that echoed through the structure, giving it both physical and spiritual stability. He walked deeper into the scaffolded area where interior walls were being smoothed. The sound there changed. It became more muted, absorbed by stone. Workers knelt in dimmer light, rubbing surfaces with sandstone blocks, leaving them astonishingly flat. Another crew mixed gypsum plaster, spreading it onto joints to seal gaps. Even the ceiling was ritualistic, smooth, slow, careful. When he stepped back into sunlight, the plateau had grown busier. More hauling teams arrived. More scribes recorded progress. A group of surveyors prepared a new set of sightlines, extending toward the quarry road. But despite the activity, nothing felt rushed. He realized something quietly important. The pyramid wasn't built by forcing labor to move faster. It was built by making every part of the process dependable. Reliability over speed, precision over force, patience over urgency. And as another block began its slow journey up the ramp, the wind shifted once more, carrying that chalky, ancient scent of limestone, fresh, sharp, and timeless. The engineer closed his eyes, breathed it in, and felt himself drifting deeper into the quiet heartbeat of this impossible, beautiful construction. The scent of freshly cut limestone lingered in the warming air, drifting like pale dust suspended in sunlight. It wrapped itself around the ramp, around the workers, around the engineer standing quietly at the edge of the platform. The desert was fully awake now, but still gentle, as if the heat had not yet remembered its true power. For a moment, the engineer simply breathed in that ancient, chalky smell, sharp, dry, familiar, almost medicinal in its purity, while the steady hiss of sand moving under feet continued around him like a low whispered chant. The slow ascent of the next block had begun. Its shadow slid over the ramp like the passing of a small cloud. Ropes tightened, muscles moved. The wooden sled creaked softly, but the sound was never harsh. It was a rhythm, a collaboration between stone and human effort, and the engineer watched every part of it with thoughtful, unhurried attention. The hauling team leaned forward, perfectly synchronized, their bodies angled in the same direction, their feet pushing against the damp, compacted sand. It wasn't brute force holding the operation together, it was technique. Each worker pulled with a measured, efficient stride, allowing the ropes to bear the load evenly. No one jerked or rushed. The rope fibers responded like something alive, vibrating faintly as they carried the tension forward. The engineer walked beside them, studying the distribution of effort. Some workers pulled at the front, others stabilized the sides. Two men behind controlled the angle, ensuring the block could never slide backward or shift dangerously. He admired how the entire team functioned like a single machine with human parts. Yes, but governed by rules of force, friction, balance, and timing so well understood that they didn't need to talk to one another. Their movements were an unspoken language. As they neared the midsection of the ramp, he turned his gaze to the structure itself. The ramp wasn't dusty and crumbling, as many modern illustrations showed. It was maintained meticulously. The surface was smooth where it needed to be, rough where traction mattered most. The gravel had been swept into deliberate patterns. In many places, he could see tiny tracks left behind by the wooden runners, parallel grooves that told the story of hundreds of stones pulled up this path before. He walked ahead and lightly pressed his foot onto the surface. It didn't sink. The ramp held firm, packed by countless footsteps and reinforced by retaining walls built of limestone rubble. Some sections were hardened with mud plaster, others were layered with crushed stone. Engineers of the time had clearly experimented, adjusting materials based on weather, incline, and load. This wasn't a single ramp design, it was a living system constantly refined. Ahead, a group of men were busy repairing the edge of the incline. The engineers slowed to observe. They packed earth and gravel into place with flat wooden tools. Others lifted heavier limestone fragments to strengthen the lip of the platform. One man poured a slurry of clay and water into a crack, smoothing it with his bare hand until the edge looked seamless again. Continuous maintenance, continuous vigilance. That was how the ramp endured. The hauling team reached the upper platform now, easing the block into a resting position. The rope slackened. A few men wiped sweat from their eyes. Others took small sips from a clay jug passed between hands. There was no rush to set the block immediately. The block needed to settle briefly after the haul, just enough for small vibrations to dissipate, for the air to cool its surface, and for the workers to prepare the space where it would eventually rest. The engineer stepped closer to the block, brushing a hand along its surface. The limestone was cool now, but the desert sun would warm it soon. He inspected the subtle, shallow grooves left by copper chisels. These marks were almost invisible unless viewed at the right angle, but they told him everything: how many strokes it took, how sharp the chisel had been, how freshly the stone had been quarried, even how experienced the mason was. Stone kept the fingerprints of its makers. A team of masons approached with their tools. They carried chisels, smoothing stones, wooden mallets, and measuring cords. One of them glanced at the engineer and gave a small, respectful nod before kneeling beside the block. He dipped his brush in red ochre and made a fine marking along the stone's edge, part of a larger grid that guided their work across the entire face of the pyramid. No marks were random. Every shape, every cut, every adjustment belonged to a system. The engineer took a step back to observe the gridwork more closely. Thin red lines ran along certain blocks, forming faint geometric patterns: triangles, rectangles, and angle references. These were precise layout marks used to maintain the pyramid's taper. Without them, the structure would drift outward or inward, losing its iconic shape. The masons followed these lines with unwavering discipline. They were the silent guardians of accuracy. He turned toward the far end of the platform, where a group of surveyors prepared to perform their midday checks. 2 long wooden poles were planted in the ground. A taut string stretched between them. The surveyors moved along the string, sighting down its length, adjusting small stone markers placed earlier. Their movements were slow, deliberate. Danos and Hekanek, names he had heard, were 2 senior surveyors who rarely spoke, but when they did, their voices carried quiet authority. These were the mathematicians of the desert, the keepers of straightness, the protectors of angles. The engineer watched as one of them bent over a marker stone, brushing away sand to reveal a carved notch. He lined the notch with a distant pole near the horizon. He then checked the angle of the string with a plumb bob, a simple tool, but one that never lied. The string hung perfectly vertical, its shadow a straight dark line on the gravel. He nodded with satisfaction and moved to the next marker. Maintaining alignment wasn't a single event, it was a constant ritual. If the pyramid were even slightly misaligned over hundreds of courses, the error would become monumental. But here, the system worked because every small correction was made in real time, with unbroken attention. The engineer found himself drifting toward the shade of a large tent set up for the scribes. Inside, rows of wooden tablets lay across a low table. Each tablet held lists of stone deliveries, worker schedules, weight estimates, and angle checks. The scribes sat quietly, occasionally dipping their reed pens into black ink to record the passing of another hour. Their handwriting was controlled, calm, methodical. Without them, chaos would reign. On one tablet, he saw a diagram of a pulley-like arrangement used to lift stones into tight spaces where dragging was impossible. These were not pulleys in the modern sense, but rope loops and wooden pegs acting as friction brakes. Simple, yet far from primitive. The Egyptians had turned limited materials into efficient mechanical systems that distributed load and maximized human effort. He stepped outside again, blinking at the brightness. Workers were assembling a wooden crane, a lever and counterweight mechanism made of cedar beams. The counterweight was a basket filled with rubble and sand. When hoisted, it helped lift blocks along steep sections where ramps alone weren't ideal. The engineer walked around it, admiring its simplicity. a fixed beam, a pivot point, a long arm that multiplied force. A child could operate it with training, and here it was, being used to position multi-ton stones on the highest courses. The crane's arm creaked softly as it was tested. The counterweight rose slowly, the basket swaying a little before stabilizing. A mason adjusted the pivot peg, ensuring smooth rotation. Another worker tightened the ropes. The engineer watched it all, seeing the process with dual awareness. Part of him observed as a modern engineer, recognizing physics he had studied. The other part felt as though he had slipped into the mind of the ancient builders themselves, understanding their work not through theories but through touch, weight, heat, rhythm, and patience. A soft gust of wind blew across the plateau again. Sand lifted in thin spirals. The scent of limestone remained strong, blending with the warm, earthy smell of clay plaster drying on the stones. The engineer let his eyes wander to the horizon, where the quarry road stretched like a pale scar across the desert. Tiny figures moved along it hauling teams, returning with fresh blocks, oxen pulling carts of tools, children running alongside with baskets of water. Thousands of lives, he thought, quietly intertwined with this monument. He turned back toward the pyramid. The next block was ready. The masons had prepared the receiving surface. The crane arm swung gently into place. The hauling team adjusted their ropes with quiet professionalism. Everything was prepared for this single block, and yet it was only one of millions. The engineer stepped aside as the foreman raised his hand. The block lifted slightly, its weight balanced perfectly between the crane arm and the guiding ropes. The workers grunted softly, not with strain but with timing, adjusting their stance as the block hovered, moved, and finally settled into its exact position against the previous stone. Another thud, another puff of dust, another perfect alignment, piece by piece, moment by moment. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. The engineer closed his eyes again. He could feel the heartbeat of the pyramid inside the ground beneath him, the rhythm of labor, the pulse of precision, the slow, deliberate breathing of a monument taking shape through hands that understood both strength and subtlety. The day would continue like this, and the next day, and the next. Stone by stone, the pyramid rose quiet, patient, exact, and high above the desert. The sun kept carving its slow arc across the white sky, as if marking time for the builders who worked beneath it. The men who understood the language of stone and weight and slope far more intimately than they understood the politics of pharaohs or priests. The heat trembled over the plateau, but the project moved with a steady pulse, a rhythm that belonged not to the sun but to the system the engineers had imposed. One cut, one haul, one placement at a time, hundreds of thousands of repetitions, each one stitched into the growing mass of the pyramid. Down among the workers, the rumble of sledges and the grunt of human effort became part of the desert itself, a low, continuous vibration that echoed in the scaffolding, in the wooden levers, in the limestone dust drifting over the surface. At this point in construction, the pyramid was already rising high enough that hauling stones vertically became a challenge far more complex than hauling them horizontally. The engineers, thin men with shaved heads and simple linen garments, moved through the site with tablets of smoothed wood coated in soot and chalk. On these dark boards, they scratched measurement angles of ramps, stress loads on beams, the weight tolerance of ropes woven by the specialized craftsmen along the river. Everything had to be balanced. The slope of the pyramid face, the thickness of each layer, the distribution of blocks so the interior didn't shift under compression. The entire geometry had to remain perfect even as the scale increased. To lift blocks higher, they had begun extending the ramp system, not as a single massive ramp, which would have required impossible material, but as an elegant network of tiered ramps hugging the pyramid's sides. These ramps wrapped around the structure like giant stone spirals. As the pyramid rose, the ramps rose too, always one level ahead of the builders. By this stage, the master engineers had made the decision to divide the labor on the ramps into 3 specialized teams. The haulers who dragged the blocks upward using ropes and sledges, the stablers who ensured the ramps remained firm under the sliding weight, and the adjusters who shaped the stones precisely at the top before installation. Every decision reflected engineering logic. A single crack in the ramp system could destroy weeks of progress. A misaligned block could distort the slope. A frayed rope could send a stone tumbling, destroying scaffolding or injuring workers. The smallest variables mattered: humidity in the air, tension in the fibers, the the friction of sled runners against the clay-slicked ramp surface. Near the base, an older engineer stood with a set of measuring rods, checking the straightness of the alignment lines stretching across the sand. These lines, formed by thin cords coated in red pigment, defined the pyramid's edges. The cords were anchored to precise setting points, aligned with the cardinal directions, using a simple but astonishingly accurate method, sighting the stars during the night and tracking the shadow cast by a gnomon during the day. Even now, as construction advanced, the alignment cords were checked again and again, because even a slight drift at the base would become a major deviation near the summit. Higher up, the stone shapers worked under makeshift canopies of woven reeds to shield them from the sun. Their bronze tools, chisels, adases, hammer-struck stone with alternating rhythms. These men didn't cut stones to be perfectly smooth. They only shaped the underside and the joining faces. The outer faces, which would one day gleam under a polished white casing, were left rough for now. Precision mattered where blocks touched each other, not where the desert wind would someday brush across the finished surface. The masters of fit and friction used a remarkable method to achieve near-zero gaps. They rubbed two blocks together, letting the rougher one grind down until both surfaces sat flush. It was a slow and laborious process, but it ensured stability without the need for mortar. As the day lengthened, the ramp system began to glow with sunlight. Workers poured jars of water along the ramp path, darkening the clay surface into a slick track that reduced friction. The engineers knew this was essential. Water softened the fine dust, preventing sled runners from sparking small avalanches of grit. Rope teams took their positions, forming long lines of men who pulled in perfect unison. The lead caller lifted his arm, then lowered it sharply. The ropes went taut, muscles tightened, feet dug into the ramp. The stone began its slow, groaning journey upward. Halfway up the ramp, stabilizers leaned wooden braces into position, wedging them beneath carefully spaced niches in the ramp wall. These braces bore some of the dynamic load each time a block passed. Without them, the ramp surface would crumble under the constant frictional stress. The engineers inspected each brace, tapping it with the handle of a chisel to listen for hollow sounds that indicated weakness. Everything had to be solid. Everything had to be predictable. At the top of the ramp, adjusters prepared for the incoming block. They cleared stray dust, checked the positioning marks, and measured the final angles. When the block arrived with its dull scraping sound, they guided it onto a series of wooden rollers laid temporarily across the working platform. Using lever bars and carefully placed wedges, they inched the block sideways into its final place, aligning it with the stones beneath. When it fit perfectly, the chief adjuster nodded once, a small gesture that meant the system was still working. Below, the Nile breeze pushed lightly against the construction site. The smell of wet clay, wood resin, powdered limestone, and human sweat blended into one continuous scent. The engineers breathed it without thinking. It had become the perfume of their profession. But behind the massive physical effort, something less visible was happening. Constant calculation. One engineer bent over a board, marking the stress distribution for the next course of blocks. He was considering where microcavities should be introduced within the inner layers to reduce weight, while maintaining compression integrity. The internal structure of the pyramid was in a solid mass of identical blocks. It was a deliberately engineered pattern of dense load-bearing sections interspersed with lighter filler zones, all arranged to channel weight downward efficiently. Another engineer tracked worker fatigued patterns. He had noticed that rope teams pulling at midday were less synchronized, leading to jerking movements that put sudden strain on the sled runners. He recommended shifting the heavy hauls slightly earlier in the morning and later in the afternoon, using midday for stone shaping and rest. Over time, this adjustment would save countless injuries and speed up work by reducing rope breakage. The higher the pyramid grew, the more the desert wind changed. It funneled around the rising structure, creating subtle shifts in pressure that affected dust patterns. Engineers observed these as well, noting how the wind carved microchannels along the ramp edges. Sand accumulation could slow sleds or destabilize footing, so workers swept the ramps constantly, using bundles of palm fronds tied into thick brushes. More stone arrived, more ropes tightened, more dust rose around the spiral ramps, and as the sun descended toward the west, painting long shadows across the plateau, the engineers stepped back to observe the growing silhouette of the pyramid. They measured the slope angles again, sighting along straight rods held at arm's length. Everything still converged toward the invisible apex above, a point not yet reached but already present in their minds. The geometry held, the rhythm held, the system held. The workers continued shaping and hauling until the final rays of sunlight caught the uppermost stones, turning them a deep amber. When the foreman finally signaled the end of the day, the site fell gradually into a quiet stillness. The ramps cooled, the ropes loosened, the tools were collected, the dust settled, and in that moment, when the last echoes died away, the pyramid stood one layer higher than it had in the morning, one layer closer to its final form, one layer closer to fulfilling the engineer's vision, rising slowly methodically toward the sky. And as twilight deepened and the first evening stars appeared, the engineers gathered at the base again, discussing the next stage, how to extend the spiral ramps further, how to manage the increasing weight at higher levels, and how to ensure precision never wavered as the structure climbed toward its impossible height, rising now like a man-made mountain whose slope and angle had to remain perfect despite the thousands of hands shaping it. The engineers moved across the dimming plateau with their tablets tucked under their arms, discussing load distribution, contour adjustments, and the future extension of the ramp system. The desert was cooling, letting out the heat it had gathered all day, and the wind felt different, cooler, sharper, almost metallic as it brushed against the half-finished stones. It seemed to whisper across the surface, passing between the scaffolding beams and fluttering the linen garments of the workers who were preparing the site for the next morning. In the fading light, the engineers walked to the edge of the highest, currently completed layer. From there, the view was wide and commanding. The horizon stretched endlessly, the Nile glowed like a silver thread in the distance, and far below, the lights of temporary workers' camps flickered like a scatter of embers. But the engineers were not looking at the scenery. They were looking downward along the pyramid face, studying how the ramp spiraled around the structure. The ramp now reached a height where its outer edge was dangerously exposed to wind pressure and shifting sands. This meant reinforcement was essential. One engineer knelt and traced a line in the dust with his fingertip, outlining how the next section of the ramp would curve inward slightly to reduce lateral wind load. Another recommended adding supporting buttresses along the exposed edged more retaining walls made of rough limestone blocks, packed with clay and gravel. These would absorb the sheer force caused by sudden wind bursts. Their work was less glamorous than the hauling teams or the stone setters, but without these calculations, the entire ramp, this lifeline for vertical progress, could collapse. Far below, the stone yards were quiet now, but earlier in the day they had been loud with the sound of chisels striking stone. Thousands of blocks lay in different stages of preparation. Some had been roughly cut from the quarries, others had been shaped more precisely, stacked in neat rows like giant bleached bricks waiting for their turn. Workers had dragged the newest loads of heavy limestone from the riverbank, using sledges on tracks that had been sprayed with water to reduce friction. It was a process so repetitive that it became almost meditative, a cycle of cutting, hauling, lifting, aligning. The engineers reviewed the tall stacks of pre-cut blocks waiting for placement. They checked the marking system used by the stone shapers, chalk symbols on the sides of blocks that signified weight category, grain orientation, and designated location on the next layer. Each block was labeled according to its structural purpose. Some were primary load-bearing stones. Others were fillers, lighter pieces that occupied space between the structural ribs hidden deep inside the pyramid. Without this internal skeleton, the pyramid might crack under its own weight, decades or centuries later. This was long-term engineering, the kind that cared not for the lifespan of the builders themselves, but for the future stability of a monument intended to outlive entire civilizations. During the engineer's inspection, a younger apprentice approached with a bundle of papyrus records. He was responsible for tracking output. How many stones had been shaped that day? How many had been transported? How many had reached the top of the ramps? Everything had to be recorded precisely. The engineers believed in numbers as much as they believed in stone. The apprentice reported that the hauler teams had moved slightly fewer blocks today due to midday fatigue. The chief engineer nodded thoughtfully. Tomorrow, the hauling schedule would be shifted earlier at sunrise, when the ground was cooler and the men were stronger. As the night deepened, the air grew surprisingly cool, and the engineers lit small oil lamps to continue their work. The flickering glow cast long shadows on the stones around them. They gathered around a large layout board where small wooden markers represented different sections of the pyramid. This board was the master plan, a scaled model of the ongoing construction. Every layer was mapped onto it. As each course of blocks was completed, they moved the marker up one level, adjusting the estimates for labor and material for the next course. At this stage of construction, the pyramid had reached a point where internal chambers and passages needed to be sealed or reinforced before the outer layers grew too high. The grand gallery and associated corridors had been carefully carved earlier, but now the engineers had to ensure their ceilings were strong enough to bear the increasing weight above them. The core belt ceiling's edge layer protruding slightly inward over the one below distributed the load outward instead of downward, but this only worked if the blocks above were placed with absolute precision. Even a slightly misaligned stone could disturb the load path, placing shear stress where none should exist. One engineer, responsible for the internal chambers, suggested adding a secondary set of relieving stones above one of the main ceiling's angled blocks that would channel weight away from the vulnerable central corridor. He drew the idea on a soot-covered tablet, sketching the angled lines with practiced ease. The others nodded. It was a simple, elegant solution. Meanwhile, out on the darkened plateau, the haulers and laborers retreated to their camps. Fires were lit, and the smell of lentil stew drifted across the desert. Men talked quietly, eating their simple meals, rubbing sand and clay from their tired hands. Some massaged their shoulders and backs, sore from pulling ropes all day. Others sharpened tools or rewove rope fibers to make new hauling lines. The desert night was peaceful, the stars bright above, but the sense of purpose radiated even in the silence. Back at the base of the ramp, several engineers returned to study the giant wooden rollers that would be used in the next day's hauling. These rollers had to endure tremendous pressure, and their geometry mattered. They checked for cracks, rotated them slowly to detect any uneven wear, and made notes to replace several within the next 2 days. If a roller failed during hauling, a block could tip, break, or injure the workers pulling it. Predictability was everything. Toward midnight, the engineers gathered near the top of the ramp again. They inspected the interface between the newest course of stones and the one below it. This was a crucial moment, each day ensuring the newly placed stones had settled exactly where intended. They ran their palms across the joints, feeling for irregularities. They checked the alignment lines again, shining lamplight along the edges. The pyramid's face still tilted inward at the perfect angle. The angle chosen centuries earlier, a slope steep enough to look majestic, but shallow enough to resist structural failure. A soft breeze carried the dry scent of the desert across the platform. The men breathed it in deeply, feeling the weight of their responsibility. They were engineers, but in a sense, they were also guardians of knowledge. Their methods had been passed down through generations, not written in books, but preserved in memory, in hands-on practice, in the language of measurements and angles, spoken quietly in workshops and quarries. And they were aware that if they failed, the monument would not endure. It would crumble, and all their precision, all their calculation, all their labor would mean nothing. One engineer pointed upward toward the invisible future apex and spoke softly about the challenge still ahead. As the pyramid grew taller, the ramps would become longer, more winding, more complex to maintain. The higher they went, the more the wind would interfere, the more the sun would scorch the exposed workers, the more material they would need to drag upwards. But for each challenge, there was a solution waiting to be discovered. Engineering was, after all, the art of solving problems step by step, stone by stone. Eventually, the night wore on and the stars shifted overhead. The lamps flickered low and the engineers dispersed, leaving only the quiet shape of the unfinished pyramid behind them. It loomed in the moonlight, its geometric edges softened by the darkness, rising into the night like a silent guardian carved from the desert itself. And though it was still far from complete, the intention behind it was already unmistakable. The structure was becoming what it was meant to be, a monument shaped by precision and patience, a creation of human ingenuity and unrelenting effort. By dawn, the camp would stir again. The haulers would wake, stretching their arms and preparing for the first heavy pulls of the day. The stone shapers would sharpen their tools under the first light of the sun. The engineers would already be walking across the ramp system, checking the new adjustments and preparing the next stage of the ascent. The desert would warm. The ramps would fill with movement, and the pyramid slowly, inexorably, would continue its climb toward toward a summit no one had yet seen, but all could envision in their minds. Would continue its climb toward a summit no one had yet seen, but all could envision in their minds. The invisible peak they carried within them, like a shared memory of something that did not yet exist. As the first faint light crept across the eastern sky, turning the edges of the desert pale and silvery, the workers rose from their simple bedding and prepared themselves for another day of pulling, shaping, measuring, and lifting. The engineers were already awake, as they always were before sunrise, standing along the ramp to see how the night air had affected the clay surface and whether the coolness had stiffened or loosened the packed earth beneath the sled tracks. The desert morning was quiet in those first moments. The air was still, and the pyramid loomed like a dark mountain against the slowly brightening horizon. Its incomplete peak looked jagged in the pre-dawn shadow, a reminder of the work still ahead. But as the sky lightened, revealing the crisp edges of the stone courses, the structure regained its clarity and purpose. The engineers took note of the slight dew that had formed on some of the higher stones. They brushed it off, aware that moisture could make certain surfaces slick, altering the friction they relied upon when maneuvering blocks. Down at the stone yard, the shapers began their rhythmic work. The sound of bronze striking limestone echoed across the plateau in sharp, steady bursts. Each shaper had a designated task: trimming the underside, smoothing the joining faces, ensuring the weight distribution matched the markings on their papyrus lists. A senior shaper walked among them, inspecting their work. He held up a finished block, studying the way the grain ran through it. Grain direction was important. A block placed with its grain misaligned could crack under vertical load, weakening the entire layer above it. Close to the riverbank, hauling crews prepared the next rows of stones. The sledges they used were reinforced with thick leather strips and small wooden ridges to catch the ropes properly. Men tested the ropes, pulling them with increasing force to check for strands beginning to wear thin. Those ropes that creaked or twisted irregularly were discarded immediately. New ropes woven during the night replaced them. The strength of the rope teams rested largely on the reliability of the materials connecting human effort to stone mass. The first major haul of the day began as the sun rose, painting the sky in soft oranges and pale golds. The lead caller, standing at the front of the team, raised his hand and shouted the first coordinated command of the morning. The haulers leaned forward in unison, their heels digging into the cool earth. The sledge shuddered at first, resisting movement, but then slowly began to slide, carving twin parallel grooves into the dampened clay. The rhythmic chant rose with each heave, keeping the team synchronized. To the engineers watching from above, the sound of the chant was as crucial as any tool. Synchronization minimized sudden jerks that could strain ropes, destabilize loads, or injure workers. As the block ascended the ramp, stabilizers moved alongside, adjusting braces and checking the compactness of the earth. Small cracks forming along the ramp edge were quickly filled with wet clay and tamped down with wooden mallets. The engineers observed everything: the angle of the sled, the speed of the haul, the sheen of moisture across the clay. Even the shift of the workers' feet mattered, because every small variable was multiplied by the weight of the block and the incline of the ramp. At the highest platform, adjusters prepared to receive the incoming stone. They cleared dust, ensured the rollers were correctly aligned, and positioned their large wooden levers nearby. When the block finally arrived, it was greeted with a series of carefully orchestrated movements. The adjusters pulled it onto the platform, guided it with subtle pressure from the levers, and eased it toward its designated location along the next course. Each movement was slow and deliberate, designed to ensure the block settled precisely into place. Once positioned, the chief adjuster approached with a straight wooden rod used to check alignment between adjacent blocks. He placed the rod across the gap and inspected the line of contact, checking for unevenness. Satisfied, he tapped the corners gently with a wooden mallet, a ritual that signaled the exact moment when a stone became part of the pyramid itself. While the stone was being set, a pair of engineers stood nearby, discussing the slope angle. They carried a plumb line, a simple weight, suspended from a long cord, and held it against the pyramid face to verify the angle remained true. Even with tens of thousands of stones already in place, the structure remained astonishingly precise. The engineers traced their fingers along the smooth chalk guideline drawn months earlier, and confirmed that the alignment had not deviated even a fingertip's width. It was a testament not only to engineering but to the coordinated discipline of every worker involved. Throughout the morning, the site grew busier. More blocks reached the ramps, more shapers prepared new stones, more engineers moved through the platforms, studying stress points, managing logistics, and overseeing adjustments. One team focused on reinforcing the internal chambers that would soon be sealed forever. They inspected the corbelled ceilings, listening for unusual echoes that might signal a weakness. They applied bitumen and clay to fill minor imperfections and placed angled relief blocks that would divert weight away from vulnerable sections. Meanwhile, the spiral ramp continued to rise around the structure. Workers extended its edge by laying fresh blocks, rough and unpolished, held in place by packed gravel and clay. This outer frame of the ramp acted as both a protective barrier and a guide for the hauling teams. The engineers marked the ramp's next upward turn with bright red pigment, directing the path it would take as it climbed toward the unfinished upper levels. Maintaining the smooth curvature of the ramp was essential. Any sharp turn would make hauling far more difficult and dangerous. Later in the day, as temperatures rose, the work shifted into alternating cycles to protect the workers and the materials. Hauling slowed during the hottest period, giving way to tasks less demanding on the body. Engineers examined the wooden scaffolding that rose along the pyramid's outer edges. These scaffolds supported workers who chipped away rough protrusions or filled tiny gaps between stones. They also provided crucial platforms for engineers to measure downward angles and check alignment from multiple vantage points. It was during one of these midday inspections that a junior engineer noticed a slight shift in one of the ramp's support buttresses. It was subtle, a tiny compression mark where the clay had settled unevenly. He called for the chief engineer, who examined the spot closely. The buttress had begun to bow inward under the combined pressure of repeated hauling and wind erosion. Left unattended, it could eventually collapse, potentially triggering a cascade that might damage the ramp. The chief engineer immediately ordered temporary reinforcement. Workers arrived with rough limestone blocks and wooden beams. They built a secondary brace against the weakened segment, packing it tightly with gravel and clay. Then they drove thick wooden stakes into the ground at an angle to anchor the support structure. The engineers inspected the final result, tapping it with wooden mallets and listening for solidity. The fix would hold for now, buying the ramp many more days of reliable use. As afternoon stretched on, the wind began to rise again, sweeping across the plateau with a hot, gritty force. Sand collected in small drifts along the ramp edges and accumulated in cracks between stones. Workers moved quickly with broom-like bundles of bound palm fronds, pushing the sand aside. The engineers understood that even a thin layer of loose sand could disrupt the friction balance, making sleds skid unpredictably. Ramps had to be kept clean, compact, and predictably rough. Gradually, the angle of the sun shifted, and the intense heat mellowed once more. As shadows lengthened, the hauling teams returned to their work with renewed strength. Block after block ascended the ramps, each one a step closer to the final form the engineers envisioned. These light afternoon hauls often produced the best progress. The temperature was cooler, the workers were recovered, and the clay ramps offered ideal traction. Near sunset, the plateau glowed with soft orange light. The pyramid's face reflected the warmth, and the stones seemed to radiate a quiet, patient power. The engineers climbed to the highest accessible platform and looked out over the vast landscape. The Nile shimmered in the distance. The workers' camps flickered with early fires. The ramps wrapped elegantly around the monument, their curves like pathways drawn from earth to sky. The chief engineer rested his hands on the cool stone and nodded with the kind of satisfaction that came not from pride but from the recognition that the work was unfolding exactly as planned. The pyramid had grown another layer today. Another ring of stone had risen toward that unseen apex. Another set of calculations, adjustments, corrections, and coordinated actions had brought the entire structure closer to its final, eternal shape. As the sun dipped below the horizon and twilight took hold, the workers finished their tasks. The tools were gathered, the ramps grew quiet, and the desert returned to stillness. Yet beneath the silence lay the memory of thousands of movements, measured, controlled, deliberate, contributing to the growing mountain of stone. And somewhere within that rising structure, the future summit waited, invisible but inevitable. And so the night deepened, further over the unfinished pyramid, the stars pooling above like flecks of cold silver suspended in the warm Egyptian darkness, while the workers settled into their sleeping spaces with the same quiet acceptance they carried through every part of their lives. The desert wind whispered round the edges of the temporary village, lifting a few grains of sand and brushing them across the packed earth paths that wound between the long barracks, the workshops, and the storage yards. The air had a softness to it now. The day's heat finally retreated into the stones and the sands, leaving a mild coolness that soothed tired muscles and eased heavy minds. Inside the engineer's tent, the faint glow of a small oil lamp trembled against the linen walls. The engineer remained awake longer than most, sitting on a low stool, elbows balanced on his knees, a small piece of limestone resting in his palm. Not a carved block, not a tool, just a broken shard he had picked up during the day when one of the laborers pointed out a flaw in a load of stone coming from a nearby quarry. He ran his thumb over its surface, listening to the quiet outside, allowing the stillness to settle around him like a fine layer of dust. His thoughts drifted between the practical and the philosophical measurements, timetables, load calculations, but also the weight of legacy, the knowledge that this pyramid would stand longer than nearly any living memory. Every decision he made, every judgment call, would be permanent in a way few human acts ever were. He set the limestone shard beside the lamp and reached for a small roll of reed fiber twine. Earlier that afternoon, a team had brought him a new idea that he'd been playing with in the quarry staging area. A simple twist of ropes and wooden pins that might allow crews to guide blocks with more control during descents down the ramps. The engineer had smiled when he saw it, impressed not by the design itself, which was rough, but by the initiative. Now, in the quiet of his tent, he tested the concept again, looping the twine around a bit of carved scrapwood, imagining how it might behave when scaled up to real dimensions. As he worked, the sounds of the night shifted slightly. A donkey brayed somewhere near the grain store. A distant thump echoed from the workers' barracks, someone adjusting their bedding, or perhaps one of the supervisors knocking on a door to check on an injured worker from the West Ramp team. Everything felt alive in its own sleepy rhythm, the kind of soft, continuous motion that belonged to a place with its own heartbeat. The engineer let out a long exhale, placed the twine aside, and snuffed out the lamp. He lay down on his thin mat, the smell of linen and desert air filling his senses, and allowed himself to drift into rest. But before he reached sleep fully, his mind went once more to the ramps, the greatest logistical challenge of the entire enterprise. He imagined them in the coming months, stretching longer, climbing higher, turning at precise angles around the pyramid's growing bulk. He pictured the crews hauling sledges up the inclines, their sandals sliding in the sand, their chants echoing through the monument valley. He saw the foremen waving signals with strips of dyed cloth, calling out commands, adjusting teams on the fly. Every day, the ramps would rise, just as the pyramid itself would rise twin structures, each depending on the other. When morning came, it came slowly. The sky softened from black to deep blue to a pale lavender, the faintest hint of gold appearing along the horizon. The camp stirred in stages. First the animals in the corrals, then a handful of workers who rose early out of habit, then the cooks lighting fires in the community hearths. The engineer rose with the second wave, splashing cool water from a clay basin over his face, feeling the grit dissolve beneath his palms. He wrapped his outer linen layer over his shoulders and stepped outside, blinking at the widening dawn. Already, a few of the ramp workers were gathering near the base of the main construction incline. The previous day's haul had been strong, over 50 blocks placed, a pace that pleased the overseers, but today would require even more coordination. A smaller side ramp needed reinforcement after a minor shift in the underlying sand, and the engineer knew that if they didn't address it now, they risked a greater collapse later in the week. He walked toward the ramps, inspecting the structural supports as he went. Thick wooden beams, imported from distant forests and traded at high value, were driven deep into the sand with the help of water to firm the ground. Over these beams lay layers of packed stone and mud brick, forming a stable surface upon which the sledges could glide. The engineer crouched, running his fingers along one of the wooden posts. Its surface felt dry but solid. He made a mental note to check its moisture content again by midday. The desert could warp wood quickly, if not monitored carefully. Near the ramp space, a group of workers gathered around a transport sledge. They tied thick ropes around its frame, testing the tension, adjusting knots. The engineer approached them quietly, observing the routine they had mastered through repetition. One of the foremen, a seasoned man with sun-browned skin and a calm voice, noticed him and nodded respectfully. The engineer nodded back, but didn't interrupt. He preferred to watch, to see how the teams operated without direct instruction. It gave him insights he couldn't learn from charts or reports. The workers leaned into the ropes, bracing themselves for the first pull of the day. The block resting on the sledge was one of the larger ones, quarried from the far western site, where the limestone was especially dense. It would take careful coordination to bring it up the incline without spilling sand unnecessarily or misaligning the sledge S-path. The engineer stepped aside to give the team space. The foreman raised his arm, waited a heartbeat, then dropped it. The pull began. The sound was low and powerful. Dozens of feet dug into the sand. The ropes tightened like living things. The sledge lurched forward, sending a small spray of sand behind it. Slow, steady, measured, those were the movements that mattered. The engineer watched the team fall into their rhythm, their breaths sinking, their bodies swaying in coordinated strength. It was almost musical, a kind of working melody that echoed across the construction site. As the sledge began its climb, the engineer walked alongside, checking the ramp's surface for signs of stress. A crack in the mud brick here, a slight dip where support needed reinforcement. There, nothing dangerous yet, but enough to note in his mental ledger. He turned and shouted a quiet instruction to one of the junior supervisors, who jogged off to retrieve a team of repair workers. At the top of the ramp, the placement crew awaited the incoming block. They stood ready with wooden levers, powdered gypsum, and measuring cords. The engineer admired this team. They were the closest thing the operation had to artisans in motion. Their job wasn't only strength, it required an instinctive understanding of angles, weight distribution, and balance. One wrong placement could throw off the alignment of an entire layer of the pyramid. When the sledge crested the top of the incline, the placement crew moved in with the grace of a practiced ritual. They poured water on the sand to reduce friction, eased the block off the sledge with calculated leverage, and slowly rotated it into position. The engineer knelt near the front corner, checking alignment with a thin, stretched cord that had been coated in dark dye. He ran the cord along the block's edge, pressed lightly, and then snapped it against the stone surface, leaving a faint straight line. Perfect. The block was exactly where it needed to be. He stood, exhaled, and allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The pyramid grew by a single block, but each block was a triumph in its own way. As the sun climbed, its warmth spread quickly over the site. Workers wiped sweat from their brows, adjusted their head coverings, drank water from goatskin containers. The engineer moved constantly, inspecting, guiding, checking measurements. He paused occasionally to observe the distant horizon, where the river glimmered faintly and small boats floated like toys on its shimmering surface. Supplies would arrive later in the day: grain, pottery, copper, tools, fresh water, linen rolls for wrapping the workers' feet, and he needed to ensure space was cleared for the unloading. By midday, the heat grew heavy, a shimmering haze rising from the sand. The workers retreated into the shade for their break, gathering in clusters under simple canopies stretched between poles. They ate quietly, conserving their energy, savoring cool water before returning to the relentless rhythm of the build. The engineer sat among the supervisors, sharing a bowl of lentils and flatbread. They spoke little. Conversation came easier in the mornings or evenings, but the comfortable silence felt communal, a shared understanding of the task ahead. When the break ended, the engineer rose and wiped his hands clean. He checked the sun's angle, measured the shadow of a long beam driven into the sand, and noted the time. Another team would soon begin hauling blocks from the symmetrically aligned eastern ramp, and he wanted to observe their progress. The afternoon passed in cycles of motion, hauling, placing, inspecting, adjusting. The pyramid rose higher by the hour, its sides shimmering under the sun, each block catching light differently. From the ground, the workers could no longer see the top without stepping back a considerable distance. It was growing into something immense, something that no one fully understood yet, not even those building it with their own hands. As the sun dipped lower toward evening, the engineer climbed the ramp alone, seeking a vantage point. From the top, he could see the entire site spread out below him: the worker village, the quarries, the incoming boats on the river, the growing pyramid rising beneath his feet. The wind brushed against his clothing as he stood there, imagining what the structure would look like in a decade, in a century, in 1,000 years. He pictured the final capstone, gleaming in the sun. He pictured the funeral rites of a pharaoh, the incense, the chanting, the belief that this home of eternity would guide a king into the afterlife. And standing there, he felt a mixture of humility and pride. He was part of something larger than himself, larger than any of them. And yet, it all came down to moments like this: one more block placed, one more ramp reinforced, one more day of sweat and calculation and human coordination. He placed his palm on the warm limestone and closed his eyes. The evening air settled over the pyramid with a softness that felt almost like a blessing, carrying with it the faint scent of the river far in the distance. The engineer slowly descended from the ramp, his steps steady, the weight of the long day pressing into his shoulders, but softened by the quiet pride he felt. Below, the workers were beginning to gather near the communal area where a simple fire had been lit, its smoke curling upward in thin spirals that faded into the twilight. Conversations murmured through the camp, slow and tired but warm, the kind exchanged by people who knew one another's faces, routines, strengths, and weaknesses by heart. He walked past a group of young workers who had come from distant villages only a few months ago. Their hands were blistered, their backs sore, but their spirits still carried that sense of wonder, the kind that came from being part of something so monumental that it felt like stepping outside the ordinary life they once knew. One of them glanced at the engineer and nodded shyly. The engineer returned the gesture, pausing only long enough to ensure the boy's arm bandage from yesterday's scrape was still secure. Satisfied, he continued toward the supply area. The supply master was organizing the incoming loads, his movements precise despite the fading light. The man kept meticulous records of every grain sack, every pottery jar, every bundle of linens. The engineer admired his methodical nature. Without such discipline, the construction effort would collapse into chaos. The supply master greeted him quietly, motioning toward the newly arrived crates stacked neatly in rows. "These came from the riverboats just before sunset," he said, his voice low and steady. "Copper chisels, fresh rope, more plaster powder, and an order of stone polish more than usual." The engineer examined one of the jars, lifting it by its rim. "We'll need the polish soon," he murmured, more to himself than to the other man. "The inner passages are nearing their final dimensions." The supply master nodded, already organizing his thoughts into future checklists. The engineer placed the jar back carefully and stepped away, heading toward the heart of the workers' village. The night was fully formed now, deep blue and marked by the faint shimmer of the first stars. A few torches flickered along the paths, their flames bending gently in the breeze. He wandered toward one of the smaller workshops where a group of stone carvers were sharing a quiet moment before resting. They had spent the day shaping the finer pieces, the casing stones destined for the outer layers, smoothed almost to perfection. The engineer paused at the entrance, leaning lightly against the wooden frame. The carvers were speaking softly, discussing the subtle differences in limestone quality between quarries. Their hands bore the chalky white traces of their craft, and even now, in the final minutes before sleep, one of them held a chisel absent-mindedly, turning it in the torchlight as if its weight offered comfort. The engineer stepped inside and asked with a gentle tone, "How did the eastern batch compare today?" The eldest carver looked up, his eyes reflecting the warm glow of the lamp. "Denser," he replied, "harder to shape, but stronger. It will make a good surface for the outer face." The engineer nodded. "We'll shift more loads from that quarry tomorrow." Then, the carvers murmured their agreement, and the engineer bid them a quiet good night. As he stepped outside again, the night wrapped around him like a soft blanket, the camp alive with a peaceful hush of collective fatigue. A few workers played softly on red flutes near the central fire, the gentle notes drifting through the village like a lullaby. The engineer listened for a moment, letting the melody settle in his chest like a slow heartbeat. He returned to his tent, but did not enter immediately. Instead, he stood just outside, looking once more toward the great shape rising not far away. Even in the dim light, the pyramid's outline was unmistakably an angular silhouette against the sky, a growing mountain crafted by human hands. He imagined the pharaoh gazing upon it from his palace, the pride he must feel, the urgency behind every directive sent to the site. The engineer never forgot that this monument was more than stone. It was a testament to belief, power, continuity. It was a bridge between worlds, the physical and the divine. He finally stepped inside the tent and lit a small lamp. Its soft glow filled the space with a warm golden hue. He unrolled a piece of papyrus and began sketching the updated ramp angle calculations he had been thinking about since the afternoon. His lines were clean, his numbers steady, though his eyes occasionally drifted downward as weariness settled deeper into his bones. The rhythmic scratch of the reed brush on papyrus was soothing, steady, familiar. After finishing the updated diagram, he placed the papyrus beside a cluster of previous calculations, each neatly tied with twine. He extinguished the lamp and lay down on his mat. The faint sound of the flute still drifted from outside, along with soft laughter from a distant group of workers telling stories. The engineer's thoughts softened like sand slipping between fingers, drifting into dreams shaped by stone and light, and the slow rise of a monument that would outlive everyone who built it. Morning arrived gently, with colors stretched across the horizon like fabrics dyed in shades of rose, amber, and pale gold. The engineer rose before most of the camp, as he often did, enjoying the quiet that came with the earliest light. He stepped outside into the cool air, inhaling deeply. The world felt new at this hour, untouched by the heat and noise that would soon fill it. He made his way toward the ramps, the sand cooled beneath his sandals. A handful of workers were already awake, preparing tools, adjusting ropes, sipping from skins of water. The engineer greeted them with a nod, and they responded with smiles that carried a sleepy but determined energy. The day ahead would be long. The placement crews needed to finish an entire row before the sun reached its highest point, and the hauling teams were scheduled for increased loads from the east. He climbed partway up the main ramp, inspecting its surface. Overnight, the wind had carried fine sand onto the incline, and workers were already brushing it aside with wide, woven palm brooms. The engineer noted their progress, offered a few gentle reminders about the angles on the upper portion, then continued toward the top. From the elevated vantage point, he watched the first major team of the day assemble at the base. There was something elegant about the early morning preparations, the workers stretching their limbs, cracking jokes softly, checking harnesses, adjusting knots. The foreman gathered with measured calm, reviewing the day's assignments with the engineer before breaking off to relay instructions. The engineer listened carefully, adding small refinements to the foreman's plans. "Shift the second hauling team to the western incline by midday," he said. "We'll have the reinforcement completed by then. And keep an eye on the joint line. On the new row yesterday's placement was tight, so today's must be even tighter." The foremen nodded, their expressions focused. They understood the stakes of every detail. A minor misalignment early in the construction would multiply as the pyramid rose, and correcting such an error could cost weeks of hard labor. The sun gradually rose higher, softening the chill in the air. The workers gathered around the first block of the daya, massive limestone piece resting on a sledge polished smooth from countless journeys. The engineer stepped aside, letting the foreman take command. A signal was given, and the first haul of the day began. The ropes tightened, feet pressed into the sand. Voices lifted in low, synchronized chants to maintain rhythm. The block slid forward, slowly and steadily, its weight immense but controlled. The engineer walked beside the team, checking the alignment of the ropes, the distribution of strain across the workers' bodies, the condition of the sand under the sledge. The sun climbed higher as the morning passed, turning the sky a brilliant blue. Haul after haul brought more blocks up the ramps, and the pyramid grew layer by layer, inch by careful inch. The engineer spent the late morning inspecting the inner chambers, ensuring the passage dimensions remained true to the initial design. Workers lit small lamps inside the corridors, their warm glow illuminating the precision of the chisels, the smoothness of the stone surfaces. Inside the cool darkness of the passage, the engineer knelt and ran his hand along the wall. It was incredibly smooth, even to the fingertips. He listened to the faint echoes of footsteps deep within the structure. The sound felt ancient already, as if the stones themselves had begun to develop memories. As he stepped back outside into the bright light, he felt a deep sense of grounding. Each chamber, each hallway, each narrowing passage was like a heartbeat within the pyramid's hidden interior. The outer structure was monumental, but the core, the secret spaces where rituals would someday unfold, was where the true soul of the monument lived. As the afternoon moved toward evening and the day's final blocks were set, the engineer looked out across the construction site. The workers gathered once more in clusters, tired but satisfied. The pyramid stood slightly taller than the day before, its sides catching the warm glow of the late sun. glowing softly like a giant ember cooling in the desert air. The evening light faded into a muted glow that stretched across the desert like a soft veil, tinting the world in hues of warm amber and cooling violet. As the last rays brushed against the rising pyramid, the engineer allowed himself a slow breath, one that felt as though it carried both the weight of the entire day and the quiet pride of what had been achieved. The workers were dispersing now, their silhouettes drifting toward the village in loose, tired clusters, their conversations low and faintly musical in the distance. The engineer walked slowly along the base of the pyramid, trailing his fingers along the newly set stones. Their surface was still warm from the sun, holding the heat like a captured memory that would slowly fade into the night. He paused at one block whose alignment had worried him earlier in the afternoon. But now, in the softened evening light, he could see that the placement crew had corrected it perfectly before ending their shift. He smiled faintly, the corners of his lips barely lifting but the warmth spreading deeper within. Moving away from the construction site, he made his way toward the workers' village. Fires flickered between the tents and huts, casting gentle shadows on the sand. The smell of cooking lentils drifted on the wind, and the soft hum of conversations created a comforting blanket of sound. Children too young to work but old enough to imitate the world around them played near the edges of the village, dragging small wooden sledges they had made to copy the adults, laughing as they pulled them across the sand. Their laughter floated through the air with an innocence that made the engineer stop and watch for a moment, remembering a time when he too built toy sledges near his own childhood home, dreaming of great structures he would one day help create. He walked closer to the cooking area where a circle of workers were eating together, passing bowls back and forth and sharing uneven pieces of bread. They shifted slightly to make room for him, though he always declined to sit until he finished his rounds. He liked to observe the mood of the camp first, the small signs that told him whether morale was steady, whether anyone seemed troubled, whether there were whispers of injuries or frustrations that hadn't been spoken aloud. Tonight, the mood felt grounded, tired but calm. A worker called out to him, offering a clay cup of warm herbal drink. He accepted it with a nod, bringing it to his lips. The aroma was earthy and soothing, a mixture of mint and desert herbs boiled into a simple comfort. He thanked the man quietly, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest as he drank. After a few moments he walked again toward the edges of the village, where the oldest workers often gathered around a smaller fire. These were the men who had worked on pyramids long before this one, whose hands carried stories carved into every scar, whose eyes had watched pharaohs rise and fall. They saw him approaching and gestured for him to sit. He lowered himself onto the sand beside them, feeling the gentle crackle of the fire warm his legs. One of the elders, a man with deep lines etched across his face like ancient inscriptions, began speaking in a low voice. He told a story of a pyramid he had helped build many years ago, smaller than the one they labored over now, but just as revered in its time. He described how they hauled blocks through storms of sand so thick the sun disappeared, how one of the ramps had collapsed under the weight of a miscalculated angle, how they rebuilt it stronger, more stable, more precise. The engineer listened respectfully, absorbing every detail. These stories were more valuable than any written plans. They contained wisdom born from experience, warnings wrapped in memory. When the story ended, the elder looked at him and said, "Stone remembers those who shape it." The engineer nodded slowly, understanding the deeper truth beneath the simple words. As night settled into its deepest hours, he finally returned to his tent. Firelight flickered from a few remaining campfires, but most of the village had gone quiet now, wrapped in sleep. He sat inside the tent, lit a small lamp, and unrolled a fresh piece of papyrus. Tonight, he needed to calculate the shifting center of mass as the pyramid grew. With each higher level, the angles subtly changed, and the distribution of weight became more critical. He dipped his reed brush into ink and began to draw, letting his mind enter the familiar rhythm of numbers and lines. The quiet around him had a meditative quality. The soft rustle of linen in the breeze, the faint call of a night bird far from the camp, the gentle tapping of the brush against papyrus, they all wove together into a calm environment where thoughts could unfold with clarity. He worked for some time, adjusting figures, crossing out calculations, refining angles. It wasn't until the lamp's flame flickered dangerously low that he realized how late it had become. He set the papyrus aside, tied it neatly with twine, and extinguished the lamp. Laying down, He pulled the thin linen covering over himself and closed his eyes. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the completed pyramid's smooth white casing stones shining under the sun, the apex reaching toward the heavens, the pharaoh's spirit rising within its sacred geometry. It was a beautiful thought, one that carried him gently into sleep. The morning arrived again with a quiet coolness. The sky painted in soft pastels that gradually brightened as the sun approached the horizon. The engineer rose, stretched, and stepped outside. The sand was cold beneath his feet. He took a moment to watch the sunrise, appreciating the stillness before the day's labor began. Then he walked toward the ramps, wanting to inspect the reinforcement that had been finished last night. The area was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of early workers preparing tools or adjusting ropes. The engineer knelt beside the reinforced section, running his hands over the packed stone and mud brick. It felt firm, well settled, and ready to bear the weight of the next series of blocks. He nodded to himself, satisfied. A few workers approached him, carrying wooden beams over their shoulders. They greeted him warmly, and he offered a few gentle instructions on where the beams should be stored. As they moved off, he began walking along the length of the ramp, observing the small shifts in texture, the subtle variations in the sand, the early footprints that marked the path. Soon the morning light grew stronger, and the workers gathered at the base of the ramp. The foreman arrived shortly after, discussing the order of the hauls for the day. The engineer joined them, reviewing the plans, making small adjustments where needed. Today would involve several large blocks that had been transported overnight from the quarry dens, heavy pieces that would require precise coordination. The first block of the morning rested on a sledge slightly larger than usual. It shimmered faintly under the sun, its surface still carrying traces of the quarry's dust. The engineer checked the ropes, tugging on them lightly to ensure the knots were secure. The workers took their places, bracing their feet in the sand. The foreman raised his arm. The engineer stepped back as the foreman dropped his arm. The pull began. The block moved slowly, inch by inch, the sledge gliding across the sand with a deep, resonant sound that felt almost alive. The ropes stretched taut, muscles strained, and breaths synchronized in rhythmic effort. The engineer walked beside the team, noting every shift in pressure, every slight angle of movement. He could tell when someone's grip weakened or when the sand beneath the sledge felt uneven. As the team reached the incline, the engineer signaled for a slight adjustment. The workers shifted their positions, tightening the formation, ensuring balance. The ascent was steady, deliberate. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows along the ramp. At the top, the placement crew waited. The engineer observed closely as they coordinated the transition, sliding the block from the sledge onto the ramp's flat surface. The block was carefully maneuvered toward its designated place in the row. The workers used wooden levers with practiced grace, guiding the massive stone into alignment. The engineer knelt again, checking the edges with a dyed string. The line snapped cleanly onto the block, leaving a straight mark. Perfect. As the day continued, more blocks rose, more stones settled into their places. The heat grew heavy, shimmering over the sand, but the workers pushed on with disciplined determination. The engineer moved constantly, overseeing, adjusting, encouraging in quiet words. He drank water sparingly, conserving the coolness, and paused occasionally to let the breeze cool his skin. In the afternoon, he returned to the inner chambers. The workers inside were carving out the final corners of a passage, their chisels creating crisp, sharp sounds that echoed softly through the dimly lit corridors. Lamps glowed along the walls, casting golden reflections on the smooth limestone. The engineer knelt, feeling the cool stone beneath his palm, marveling again at the precision of the work. When he stepped out into the sunlight once more, the sky had shifted toward late afternoon. The pyramid cast a long shadow across the construction site, stretching like a giant sundial. The workers completed the final hauls of the day, placing the last block with tired but steady hands. Evening arrived slowly, as though giving the world time to breathe after the long day. The engineer stood at a distance and watched the pyramid glow in the fading light, its surface warm and magnificent. And once again, he felt that familiar deep certainty, the knowledge that tomorrow they would build further. Stone by stone, breath by breath, day after day, the pyramid would rise again. Night returned with a familiar softness, settling over the construction site like a quiet blessing. The engineer remained where he stood for some time, gazing at the pyramid glowing faintly in the twilight. its immense shape bathed in gentle shades of purple and blue as the last hints of daylight faded. The workers drifted back to their village in small groups, their voices low, their bodies slow with exhaustion, but their steps steady with the humility of people who knew they had added another layer to something greater than themselves. The engineer finally turned and made his way along the sandy path leading toward the village. The fires had already been lit, small circles of light flickering between the tents. The smell of warm grain and cooked lentils drifted through the air, mixing with the faint aroma of burning palm wood. He paused near one of the communal hearths where a group of workers sat in a loose circle, their bodies relaxed, their laughter subdued but warm. They greeted him with nods and tired smiles, and he offered quiet replies before continuing deeper into the village. Near the far edge, a pair of young men practiced rope techniques with a small makeshift wooden block. They looped ropes around it, pulled in unison, adjusted their footing, corrected one another's posture. Even after an entire day of hauling heavy stones, their dedication seemed unshaken. The engineer watched them for a moment, impressed by their focus even in these late hours. One of them noticed him and straightened quickly, offering a respectful gesture. "Your grip is improving," the engineer said softly. "You'll be ready for the steeper incline soon." The young man's face brightened despite his exhaustion, and he nodded eagerly. The engineer continued onward. He wandered past the craftsmen tents where stone polishers cleaned their tools with slow, methodical motions. The faint scraping sound echoed gently, rhythmic, and almost soothing. Nearby, the plaster mixers prepared their materials for the next day, stirring thick, pale mixtures in wide clay bowls. They preferred to prepare portions the night before, allowing the plaster to settle just right. The engineer observed their careful hands and nodded with satisfaction. Reaching his own tent, he lingered for a moment outside. The night was cool and calm, with the faint rustling of the desert wind passing like whispered memories across the sand. He gazed once more at the silhouette of the pyramid in the distance, before lifting the flap and stepping inside. The lamp flickered as he lit it, casting warm circles of light across his modest space. He unrolled a fresh piece of papyrus and placed it alongside the calculations from earlier in the week. The center of mass adjustments he had worked through last night needed further refinement. As he dipped his brush in ink, he felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders, not heavy enough to burden him, but present enough to remind him how many people depended on his accuracy. He worked slowly, the gentle scratch of the reed brush blending with the faint sounds of the village outside. He drew lines, crossed some out, redrew angles, adjusted slopes, recalculated weights. His mind moved smoothly, flowing between numbers and images, imagining the ramps not as drawings, but as living, shifting structures that expanded and evolved with every new block added. When he finished, he tied the new papyrus scroll with twine and placed it carefully atop the others. Then he extinguished the lamp and lay down on his mat. The distant sounds of laughter and conversation grew quieter, replaced by the soft hush of the night wind moving around the tents. The engineer let his eyes close, feeling the desert's calm settle around him. He drifted into sleep with the gentle certainty that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments, new progress, another step toward the pyramid's perfect form. Morning arrived with a pale glow edging along the horizon, illuminating the tips of the dunes with golden softness. The engineer rose before the village fully stirred, stepping outside to greet the cool air. He stretched his back, feeling stiffness ease slowly as he rolled his shoulders and inhaled deeply. A faint chorus of early voices drifted from the village cooks preparing firewood, workers assembling tools, the low murmur of men discussing assignments for the day. He made his way toward the ramps again, the sand cold beneath his feet but gradually warming as the sun lifted higher. A few early workers were already sweeping the ramp surface, clearing away the fine layer of sand that had accumulated overnight. The engineer knelt to inspect their work, nodding faint approval before rising again. As the sky brightened, the foremen approached him with their planning tablets. They discussed the order of hauls for the morning, 2 large limestone blocks from the far quarry, several medium-sized ones from the closer cut, and a handful of smaller, finely shaped pieces intended for the inner passage walls. The engineer listened, adjusting the schedule slightly based on the updated weight calculations he had completed the night before. The workers gathered soon after, forming lines at the base of the ramp. They tightened ropes, adjusted harnesses, and took positions with the quiet focus of people who knew that every step mattered. The engineer walked among them, offering soft guidance where needed, placing a hand lightly on a shoulder to correct a stance, advising a slight shift in grip, adjusting the placement of a knot. When the first block was ready, the foreman raised his arm. The engineer stepped back, watching the men lean into their ropes. The arm dropped. The sledge began to move. The block slid forward across the sand, with a deep, steady groan, like the earth exhaling under its weight. The workers' voices rose in rhythmic chants, guiding their movements, keeping their momentum steady. The engineer walked alongside, observing every detail: the strain in the ropes, the shifting positions of the workers, the slight dips in the ramp's surface. As the block ascended the incline, the engineer could feel the day's heat beginning to settle over the site, pushing gently at the back of his neck. But the workers continued their climb, the sledge moving slowly but surely upward. When they reached the top, the placement crew took over with their practiced grace. Wooden levers slid beneath the block, guiding it inch by inch into its precise location. The engineer knelt, snapping the dyed string against the stone's edge. A perfect line. Another block placed without error. As the morning progressed, the sun rose higher, illuminating the pyramid's growing face in brilliant gold. Blocks came one after another, each hauled with strength and coordination, each placed with precision. The engineer moved constantly, checking inner passages, inspecting outer faces, refining measurements. The workers maintained strong rhythm despite the rising heat, their voices echoing across the construction site as they chanted and hauled. By midday, sweat dripped from their foreheads, soaking into the linen wraps around their heads. They paused under the shade of makeshift canopies, receiving water from the supply carriers. The engineer sat briefly with a group of foremen, drinking quietly, discussing the afternoon tasks. One of them pointed toward the western incline, noting a slight unevenness near the upper corner. "I noticed it too," the engineer said softly. "After the break, I'll survey it." When the rest period ended, the engineer climbed the western ramp. The incline was steeper here, built to move smaller but more numerous blocks. He knelt at the area the foreman mentioned and examined the mud brick surface beneath the packed stone. It had shifted slightly, likely due to the pressure from yesterday's increased hauls. He called for a small crew to reinforce the section, and they arrived promptly, carrying tools and materials. He explained the necessary adjustments with calm precision, ensuring they understood which layers needed to be replaced and how the new support should be angled. With the reinforcement crew at work, the engineer turned back towards the main ramp. The workers were assembling for the early afternoon hauls, their bodies rejuvenated slightly from the brief rest. The foreman signaled the next team, and the engineer stood nearby, monitoring the distribution of weight as the block began its ascent. The afternoon wore on with warm, bright sunlight, bathing the entire site. The engineer felt beads of sweat roll down his neck, but he ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on the subtle details that defined the day's work. He inspected the alignment of each new block, adjusted ropes, corrected angles, and encouraged the workers with quiet confidence. The pyramid grew ever higher, its shape becoming more defined with each passing hour. Inside the inner chambers, workers carved out the final portions of a niche that would someday hold symbolic items for the pharaoh. The engineer stepped in for inspection, the cool, dim air wrapping round him like a welcome shadow. He ran his hand along the newly smoothed wall, marveling once again at the quiet perfection of the stone's surface. It felt almost like water under his fingertips, so smooth it barely resisted touch. When he stepped out again, the sky had shifted toward late afternoon. The workers were hauling the last blocks of the day, their movements slower but still controlled. The engineer watched from a short distance as they placed the final stone of the row. When it settled into exact position with a soft, satisfying thud, he felt the quiet thrill he always felt at the end of a productive day. The sun dipped lower, painting the pyramid in soft orange and pink hues. The workers dispersed, making their way toward the village with weary steps and quiet satisfaction. The engineer remained for a moment longer, standing at the base of the pyramid, looking up at the layers they had added today. He placed his hand on the warm limestone, feeling the day's heat slowly fading from the stone. "Tomorrow," he thought, "tomorrow we rise again." And he walked back toward the village as the sky deepened into twilight. The twilight deepened as the engineer walked slowly toward the village, his footsteps sinking softly into the cool sand. A faint breeze brushed past him, carrying with it the gentle sense of desert grasses and distant cooking fires. Behind him, the pyramid stood tall and serene in the fading light, its sharp lines blurring slightly as night folded itself around the world. He glanced back once more, feeling the same quiet awe he felt every evening, as though he were watching a giant slowly dreaming itself into completion. The village greeted him with warm pockets of firelight scattered between the tents. Workers sat in small clusters, their voices hushed with exhaustion, but touched with a kind of simple contentment that only came from a day of honest labor. Some leaned back against their sleeping mats, staring up at the first stars emerging in the darkening sky, while others shared bowls of lentils and flatbread, passing wooden ladles back and forth with slow, unhurried motions. The engineer stopped near a tent where an older stonecutter sat sharpening his tools with a rhythmic rasping sound. The man lifted his head and gave a tired smile as the engineer approached. "You've worked us hard today," the stonecutter murmured, though his tone carried admiration rather than complaint. "And you've met every challenge," the engineer replied softly. The stonecutter laughed under his breath, the sound warm and gravelly. Before returning to his work, the engineer moved on, stepping through the pools of firelight, as though drifting across small islands of warmth in a sea of cooling sand. Near the center of the village, he found a group of workers gathered around a storyteller, one of the few men who could spin tales with such gentleness that even the most exhausted laborers willingly stayed awake a little longer just to hear him. Tonight, the storyteller sat cross-legged by the fire, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his voice rising and falling like slow waves on a quiet shore. He spoke of a mythic falcon who flew so high that it brushed the sun with its wings, bringing light to the desert below. The engineer lingered behind the circle for a moment, letting the soothing cadence wash over him. The words blended with the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of shifting bodies, forming a cocoon of calm that made his eyelids grow heavy. But he knew he had more work to prepare for tomorrow, so after a few breaths, he turned away and walked quietly toward his own tent. Inside, the air was still and faintly warm, holding the last remnants of the day's heat. He lit his lamp, the tiny flame dancing gently as it settled into a steady glow. He unrolled a fresh sheet of papyrus, laid out his reed brushes, and retrieved the measurements he had recorded earlier. Tonight's task was to refine the gradient of the upper incline. As the pyramid grew taller, each adjustment became more delicate, more precise. A small miscalculation here could translate into a noticeable deviation in the pyramid's final form, and the engineer could not allow even the slightest imperfection. He dipped his brush, the ink sliding smoothly across the papyrus as he drew clean, angled lines. His wrist moved steadily, guided by years of discipline and instinct. He listened to the quiet around him, the distant murmur of the storyteller, the soft laughter drifting from another fire circle, the occasional clink of metal from the craftsman who worked longer than the rest. These sounds blended with the scratch of his brush, forming a gentle rhythm that accompanied his calculations. He paused halfway through. Something about the measurements tugged at him, a faint unease, a feeling that the angle needed a subtle adjustment even though the numbers appeared correct. He closed his eyes, imagining the ramps, the blocks, the workers moving in sync. He pictured the force of the sledge as it ascended, the distribution of weight on the incline, the shifting of the mud brick supports, and then he saw it, a tiny misalignment that would grow more noticeable with each layer added. He opened his eyes and adjusted the line by a fraction. The new slope felt right, harmonizing with the inner geometry he carried in his mind. He restored his slow breathing, completed the final calculations, and tied the new scroll neatly. The lamp flickered as he extinguished it, casting a final warm glow across the tent before darkness settled in. He lay down upon his mat, feeling the day's fatigue spread through his limbs like warm water. The soft wind brushed the sides of his tent, rustling the edges of the canvas with a lullaby-like whisper. Outside, the fires dimmed one by one, and the voices dwindled until silence embraced the village. Beneath the vast desert sky, the engineer drifted into sleep, dreaming of stone ramps, and the soft hum of work unfolding in perfect rhythm. The sun rose the next morning with gentle warmth, spilling golden light across the dunes and washing over the village. The engineer awoke to the low hum of activity workers tying sandals, adjusting head wraps, splashing water on their faces, and preparing tools. He stepped outside, stretching slowly as the cool morning breeze threaded through his hair. He joined the foremen at their usual meeting point near the base of the main ramp. They formed a small circle, their tablets held in practiced hands, their expressions alert despite the early hour. One foreman pointed out an issue with the rope supply. Another reported that a team from the secondary quarry was delayed due to a broken cartwheel. The engineer absorbed every detail, asking quiet questions, offering instructions, and adjusting the day's plan on the spot. They moved together toward the ramp, the workers gathering behind them. The sun climbed higher, painting the ramp with a soft, golden radiance. The first block of the day, a heavy limestone, piece weighted at the base of the incline, ropes secured and workers in position. The engineer inspected the placement of the ropes, gently correcting the angle of one knot and tightening another. He stepped back, nodding to the foreman. The signal was given. The haul began. The workers leaned in unison, their bodies forming a unified wave of motion. The block shifted forward, the sledge scraping across the sand with a deep, slow groan. The engineer walked alongside the team, watching the tension in the ropes, the positions of the workers' feet, the subtle shifts in their bodies as they adjusted to the growing incline. As the block neared the upper platform, the engineer noticed a slight deviation in its movement, tiny but present. He raised his hand gently, signaling the foreman to slow the pace. The workers eased their pull, allowing the block to glide more gradually. A small team moved in to adjust the stones beneath the sledge, guiding it with careful hands. The block resumed its ascent, now aligned perfectly with the intended path. Once it reached the top, the placement crew stepped in. Their movements were deliberate, precise, almost ceremonial. The engineer crouched beside them, adjusting the guiding stones, verifying the angles, and ensuring that the block slid neatly into its intended space. When the final adjustments settled into place with a soft thud, the workers stepped back, breathing deeply, their faces glowing with quiet satisfaction. Throughout the morning, block after block ascended. The workers' chants rose in warm, steady rhythms, echoing across the desert. The engineer moved constantly between ramps, between teams, between the inner chambers and outer faces of the pyramid. He adjusted plans, gave instructions, knelt beside craftsmen shaping limestone pieces with meticulous care. Around midday, the heat billowed over the site in shimmering waves. Workers paused in the shade to drink water and rest their aching limbs. The engineer sat briefly beside a foreman, reviewing the morning's progress on a tablet. Dust clung to his arms, his face glistened with sweat, and yet a quiet satisfaction pulsed within him. Every hour brought them closer to their goal. Once the break ended, he walked toward the northern edge of the construction site, where a team was preparing a new section of the ramp. They were aligning wooden beams, anchoring them into the sand, and layering mud brick around them. The engineer inspected the alignment, nodding approvingly at their progress. He pointed out one beam that needed slight repositioning. The workers adjusted it immediately, trusting his eye without hesitation. As the afternoon wore on, he stepped into one of the internal passageways to inspect newly set stones. The air inside was cool and quiet, the dim light creating soft shadows along the narrow corridor. He ran his hand along the smooth surface, appreciating the craft that went into the inner structure, the part of the pyramid that few would ever see, yet which demanded the same perfection as the outer face. When he emerged again, the sun was beginning its slow descent. The workers hauled the final block of the day, guiding it carefully into place. The soft thud marked the end of their labor, a sound that carried a gentle sense of completion. The foreman dismissed the teams, and they walked back toward the village with weary but steady steps, their voices beginning to rise again in quiet conversation. The engineer remained behind for a moment, standing at the edge of the ramp with the warm breeze brushing against him. The pyramid stretched upward, bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun. Each layer reflected the light in soft, glowing hues, as though the stone itself held a quiet fire within. He placed a hand on one of the newly set blocks, feeling the fading warmth radiate through the stone. The weight of the day settled over him, not heavy, but grounding. Another layer completed, another step closer, knowing that tomorrow the work would begin again, and the dream of the pyramid would rise a little higher into the sky. The engineer followed the dim path back into the village, where small fires flickered gently and cast long, wavering shadows across the sand. The evening air had cooled, and the faint traces of the day's heat drifted upward like memories dissolving into the night. He walked slowly, savoring the quiet, allowing his mind to ease into the comforting rhythm of dusk. By the time he reached the heart of the village, Most of the workers had already begun their nighttime routines. Some were washing dust from their hands and faces at large water jars, letting the cool liquid run over their skin. Others huddled around pots of warm stew, sharing spoons, tearing bread, and eating with slow, grateful movements. A few younger workers lingered near the storytellers, waiting for the nightly tales to begin. They settled on the sand with their knees pulled close to their chests, whispering to each other with soft, excited voices. The engineer paused in front of one such gathering. The storyteller for the night was a woman, her voice low and soothing. Her eyes half closed as she gently wove a tale about a celestial boat sailing across the sky. She spoke of a king who traveled through the heavens each night, lighting the stars with the lantern he carried in his hands. As she spoke, the workers leaned in slightly, their shoulders loosening, their breaths slowing. Even the desert wind seemed to hush itself, allowing her words to float freely through the night. The engineer let the story wash over him for several breaths before continuing on. His tent awaited him, the flaps swaying slightly with the breeze. When he stepped inside, the familiar scent of papyrus ink and sun-warmed canvas greeted him. He lit his small oil lamp, coaxing the flame to life until it cast a soft, golden glow across the interior. He sat down and unrolled the scrolls from earlier in the day. Tonight's task was to analyze the newly measured strain patterns on the upper courses. The higher they built, the more critical these assessments became. He spread out a fresh piece of papyrus and began copying the numbers, arranging them into columns, letting the lines form quietly under his brush. Each symbol represented an observation, an adjustment, a correction, all tiny decisions that safeguarded the integrity of the rising monument. As he examined the measurements, he noticed a subtle imbalance along one of the upper corners. It wasn't enough to cause immediate concern, but it was something he needed to address soon. He circled the notation gently, then drafted a plan to redistribute some of the heavier blocks more evenly over the next several layers. It would require careful coordination between the cutting teams, the hauling crews, and the platform workers. But he knew they could handle it. They had proven their precision countless times. He leaned back slightly, resting the reed brush on the edge of the small table. His eyes drifted toward the tent's entrance, where the faint glow of village fires flickered through the fabric. The voices of the workers had softened, replaced by the quiet hum of night insects and the steady whisper of desert wind. He allowed himself a slow breath, letting the stillness settle deeper into him. Soon after, he extinguished the lamp and lay down on his mat. The canvas above him fluttered gently, casting soft shadows on his face. He closed his eyes, letting the remnants of the day fade into the comforting darkness, until sleep pulled him gently into its embrace. Morning arrived with a cool breeze brushing against the tent walls. The engineer woke with a steady breath, feeling the familiar ache in his muscles that came not from discomfort but from a day lived fully. He sat up and stepped outside, where the horizon already glowed with the soft blush of dawn. A few workers were stirring, stretching, tying their head wraps. Birds circled high above the site, their silhouettes gliding gracefully in the early light. He walked toward the center of the village, where the foremen were already gathering with their tablets. They greeted him with quiet nods. The air was calm, carrying the faint scent of baking bread from the small cooking pits. The foreman discussed the day's assignments, the stone arrivals, the ramp maintenance schedule, the progress on the northwest corner. One team had reported a slightly looser patch of clay on the ramp surface, likely caused by the previous evening's winds. Another team mentioned that the water runners were short on jars and would need more delivered from the river. The engineer listened carefully, absorbing every detail. He issued instructions gently but firmly, adjusting the pacing of the hauling schedules and rebalancing the crews where needed. Once the brief meeting ended, the teams dispersed, and the engineer walked toward the base of the main ramp, where the first group of haulers had already gathered. The early morning light bathed the ramp in pale gold. Workers positioned themselves around the ropes, gripping them with quiet determination. The block that awaited them was large and perfectly shaped, marked with a faint streak of sunlight that glimmered softly across its face. The engineer inspected the ropes, adjusting one knot, shifting another, ensuring that the balance was distributed evenly. He touched the edge of the block, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath his fingertips. When everything was ready, the foreman lifted his hand. The workers leaned forward. The rope tightened. The first pull began. The block moved slowly, the sledge sliding along the dampened clay with a steady, controlled rhythm. The workers' breaths synchronized, forming a soft pattern of exhales that matched the movement of their bodies. The engineer walked alongside them, his eyes scanning the ramp, the ropes, the workers' footing. Every detail mattered. Even the way the morning dew clung to the clay surface had subtle effects on friction. He monitored the angle carefully, adjusting the pace with subtle gestures. As the block climbed higher, the workers maintained their chant, the sound carrying across the plateau like a gentle wave. The engineer admired their endurance, the quiet discipline that allowed them to move tons of stone with no complaint, no hesitation, only calm, steady resolve. When they reached the upper platform, the adjusters stepped forward. Their hands moved carefully over rollers and leverage beams, guiding the block with slow, deliberate pressure. The engineer crouched beside them, ensuring the alignment was perfect before they eased the stone into its final position. Once the block settled, the faintest thud resonated through the stone layers beneath, a soft confirmation of progress. The worker teams rotated, each group performing their tasks with the patient consistency that defined the entire operation. The engineer moved between them, offering guidance, observing details, adjusting plans. The rhythm of the day unfolded like a familiar song. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed higher, brightening the plateau. The engineer walked the length of the ramp to inspect the ramp's structural integrity. He examined the edges for signs of erosion, pressed his palm into the clay to check its firmness, and noted a few places where the surface had dried too much. He instructed the water carriers to add moisture to the upper third of the incline, ensuring the optimal balance of softness and grip. He continued toward a group of workers shaping stones for the next day. Their chisels tapped in gentle, steady rhythms, each strike sending small flakes of limestone drifting to the ground. The engineer observed the grain of the stone, offering a few soft corrections. The workers listened with quiet gratitude. They knew that his eye for detail ensured that each piece fit seamlessly into the growing monument. As the day warmed, the engineers and foremen walked the internal chambers again, inspecting the ceilings and the stress distribution inside the structure. The engineer measured the angles of the walls with his plumb line, watching the way the cord hung perfectly straight. The air inside the chamber was cool and still, carrying faint echoes of distant hammering from the outer platforms. When he emerged into the afternoon sun, he shielded his eyes briefly and looked up at the rising structure. Each tier glowed beneath the sunlight, each stone telling a silent story of human effort, patience, and cooperation. He could almost see the shape of the future summit forming in his mind, the precise point where all lines converged, the apex that would stand high above the desert long after his bones had returned to sand. The afternoon passed with the same gentle steadiness. Blocks rose, stones settled into place, workers rotated, chants echoed. The desert wind carried the smell of warm clay and limestone dust. The pyramid rose another fraction of a layer. As evening approached, the wind softened. The sunlight mellowed into a warm amber glow. The final block of the day ascended the ramp, guided by workers whose movements had grown slower but no less attentive. When the stone reached its destination, the workers took their time adjusting it, ensuring its placement was perfect. The engineer stood quietly nearby, watching with a faint, tired smile. When the stone settled with its soft, satisfying thud, the foreman stepped back and released the teams for the night. The workers drifted slowly down the ramp, their bodies tired but steady, their voices low as they spoke about dinner, rest, and the gentle night ahead. The engineer remained behind once more, looking up at the glowing monument as the sky shifted from gold to violet. Another day complete, another layer rising, another step toward the summit that waited patiently somewhere above. As the pyramid reached ever closer to touching the sky, the engineer's steps were slow and unhurried as he moved through the deepening twilight. The sand cooled beneath his sandals, the air humming softly with the quiet breath of the desert night. The lights of the village shimmered ahead of him, small pockets of warmth and comfort scattered like flickering stars, fallen gently upon the earth. He made his way toward them, feeling the familiar easing in his shoulders that always came at the end of a long, steady day. As he entered the circle of tents, he noticed a group of younger workers gathered around a fire, their faces illuminated by its gentle glow. One of them was singing softly, almost in a whisper, while the others listened with closed eyes, rocking slightly to the rhythm. The melody was simple and slow, carried on the warm air like a lullaby woven from memories of distant fields, childhood homes, and rivers that glimmered beneath different suns. The engineer paused, letting the sound settle inside him before continuing his quiet walk. Further along, an older craftsman sat beside a makeshift table, carefully oiling the wooden handles of chisels and mallets. The engineer stopped for a moment to exchange a few soft words with him, asking about the tools that would be used tomorrow. The craftsman assured him that everything would be ready. His hands moved with slow, practiced grace, smoothing the oil into the wood with gentle fingertips. He did not look tired. He looked content, as if each stroke of his cloth was both a task and a meditation. The engineer continued on until he reached the corner of the village where the water carriers were sorting jars for the next morning's journey. They were laughing quietly about some simple moment from earlier in the day, something harmless and warm that eased the weight of the long hours behind them. They greeted the engineer with soft nods before returning to their work. The clink of clay jars echoed softly through the night. When the engineer reached his tent, he paused, looking back toward the dark silhouette of the pyramid. In the moonlight, it appeared almost unreal. Its edges softened, its massive shape transformed into something dreamlike and ancient. He let his eyes linger upon it, feeling that familiar mixture of awe and responsibility settle deep within him. Then he stepped inside, lit his lamp, and sat down with his scrolls. Tonight he would prepare the next sequence of load distribution adjustments. As the pyramid grew taller, the forces acting upon each block compounded, pressing downward in ways that required careful anticipation. He unrolled the scrolls one by one, spreading them across the small table. The lamp's flame danced upon the inked symbols, casting tiny shadows that flickered like silent breaths. He spent some time reviewing the measurements from the internal chamber inspections. The ceilings were holding beautifully, the stress lines dispersing evenly across the angled blocks. But there was a new numerical pattern forming along the western corridor, subtle, faint, but noticeable to an eye trained by years of calculation. He traced the lines gently with the edge of his finger, thinking through the angles, imagining the weight from above, pressing downward, flowing through the stones like invisible currents. After a moment of stillness, he decided that the upper western course for tomorrow should use slightly lighter blocks, with heavier stones reserved for the opposite side to maintain the balance. He drafted these instructions with slow, deliberate strokes, then tied the updated scroll and set it aside. He extinguished the lamp and lay down on his mat, exhaling deeply as the darkness folded around him like a soft blanket. Outside, the desert breeze whispered through the village, carrying faint traces of laughter, singing, and the rustle of palm baskets. Sleep took him gently, like water rising around him, until he drifted into its quiet depths. He woke the next morning to the pale glow of dawn, the sky brushed with cool shades of lavender and early gold. The air was still crisp, carrying the promise of another clear day. He stepped outside and stretched, feeling the stiffness in his joints ease slowly. Workers were already gathering, adjusting ropes and fastening sandals, their silhouettes dark against the rising light. He made his way toward the foremen, who waited with their tablets. They reviewed the instructions for the day, marking the changes the engineer had written during the night. The foreman in charge of the stoneyard nodded approvingly when he saw the new load distribution notes. It would mean more precise shaping and hauling patterns, but nothing the teams couldn't handle. The engineer moved toward the ramp with the foreman, watching the early light spill across the rising structure. Even after all these months, the sight of the pyramid emerging from the morning haze stirred something deep in him, an ancient sense of purpose, a calm certainty that every action taken here mattered not just now but for generations yet to come. The first block of the day waited at the base of the ramp, its surface cool and faintly damp with dew. The workers gripped their ropes, adjusting their stances. The engineer inspected the knots, ensuring every loop was tight and every twist properly aligned. He ran his hand along the sledge, checking for cracks or warping in the wood. Satisfied, he stepped back. The signal was given. The chant began soft, steady, rhythmic. The block shifted forward, its weight settling into motion. The workers leaned together, their feet digging into the earth. The sledge climbed the ramp, the clay surface perfectly moistened from the early morning water spreaders who had worked in the dim light before dawn. As the block reached the first platform, the adjusters stepped in, guiding it with their long wooden levers. Their movements were slow but sure, their faces calm with practiced concentration. The engineer watched closely as they slid the stone toward its intended position among the growing layers. He crouched beside them, eyeing the edges, checking the fit, making sure the alignment matched the measurements on his scroll. When the block settled with a soft, satisfying sound, he nodded quietly to the team. They smiled back, a quiet exchange of pride and understanding. Throughout the morning, block after block moved steadily up the ramp. The workers' chants echoed across the plateau, sometimes rising, sometimes softening, but always maintaining that steady rhythm that held everything together. The engineer walked alongside them, adjusting small details, offering guidance, maintaining the gentle flow that allowed the entire operation to breathe smoothly from moment to moment. Around midday, he broke from the hauling path and walked toward the western side of the pyramid where the new adjustments would take place. The workers shaping the lighter blocks were already there, chiseling away with steady strokes. He watched them for a moment, noting the grain direction in each stone, the symmetry of each face. With a few soft corrections, he ensured that the pieces would fit precisely where needed. As the afternoon deepened, the heat rose again, shimmering across the desert. Workers took turns resting in the shade. The engineer drank water slowly from a clay cup, the cool liquid easing the dryness in his throat. He reviewed the progress of the day, marking notes on his tablet, adjusting tomorrow's estimations as new variables emerged. When the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the sand, the final block of the day ascended the ramp. The workers, though tired, moved with the same careful discipline as always. The adjusters guided the stone into place. The engineer watched closely, feeling a deep quietness settled within him as the stone slid into its proper position. The moment it touched the stones beneath it, the soft thud echoed gently through the structure. Another layer complete, another step upward. As the workers walked down the ramp, their voices low and warm in the cooling air, the engineer remained for a moment longer, gazing at the pyramid as it glowed beneath the fading light. He traced its lines with his eyes, imagining the summit that was still to come. He finally turned and made his way back toward the village, the night gathering softly around him once more. And as the sun slipped behind the far western ridge, the sight quieted into that familiar, rhythmic hush, the soft scrape of the last trowels, the padded thump of sandals on packed sand, the sigh of ropes relaxing after a day of strain, and the low conversations drifting like smoke through the warm air. The engineer stepped back from the rising structure, and in that moment the entire plateau felt suspended between breath and silence, as if the pyramid itself were listening. From that exact hush, the story continues. The next morning arrived without fanfare, just a pale wash of color bending across the horizon and settling over the limestone blocks that had waited in patient stillness through the night. The desert had its way of making continuity feel eternal, as though the work of yesterday was simply a ripple that stretched into today. And yet, when the engineers approached the western face of the pyramid, they noticed the subtle shifts with the eyes of people who measured time not in days but in precision. The new tension in a rope that had cooled overnight, the slight settling of sand under a sled's runners, the faint adjustment needed in a lever's placement because the angle of the sun would be different that day. And so the first task of the morning was not lifting a stone, but recalibrating. The ancient Egyptians may not have had digital instruments, but they had something arguably sharper, the trained intuition of repeated action, refined through thousands of cycles of trial, correction, and perfect alignment. The chief engineer walked the perimeter of the ramp, tapping the packed clay with the end of his survey rod. Each strike gave him information about density, moisture, hardness, and whether the climbing surface needed recompacting. A section that felt slightly soft was immediately marked with red pigment, and workers moved in to reinforce it before any block could be moved up the incline. A ramp collapse would be disastrous. Every morning began with ensuring it could bear the weight of a 62-ton stone without bowing. Beneath the rising sun, the crew began assembling the hauling team. 24 men stood on either side of the sled, their hands wrapped with leather strips to protect skin from rope burns. Their job was not just to pull, but to match each other's pace. A single mistimed tug could twist a block sideways, adding friction, wasting energy, or, in the worst case, flipping the sled entirely. So the overseer stepped forward, beat his palm rhythmically on a wooden drum-like board, and the team responded with short, affirming chants. Their voices weren't theatrical. They were functional, a sonic metronome that kept 24 bodies moving as one. Near the ramp's lower edge, water carriers sprinkled thin lines of liquid along the track. Not too much that would turn the surface into mud, just enough to reduce the coefficient of friction by a measurable, practical margin. Ancient workers didn't know the mathematics of lubrication ratios, but they understood results. Wet sand made the sled move 40 to 50% more efficiently, and it was a simple trick discovered through decades of experience. With the track prepared, the block secured, and the hauling team synchronized, the overseer raised his hand and brought it down sharply. The men leaned forward as one body, ropes tightening in a single sweep, and the block began to slide over wetted sand, groaning softly as fiber dragged against wood. Step by step, the block moved up the ramp, and the engineers watched every angle with narrow, practiced eyes. They were looking for deviations, a shift in the sled's trajectory, an imbalance in load distribution. If the left runners began biting deeper into the sand, two men would peel off instantly to re-smooth the path and keep the sled aligned. Midway up the ramp, the block reached a point where human pulling power needed reinforcement. This was where the counterweight system came in, a beautifully simple exploitation of gravity. Ropes were threaded through a wooden frame atop the ramp, connecting the stone sled to a heavy basket filled with rubble and desert stones. On command, workers stationed at the peak released the brake, and the counterweight basket, loaded with nearly a ton of debris, plunged downward along a parallel chute. As it fell, its weight transferred through the rope system, lifting part of the burden from the hauling crew. The men still pulled, but instead of struggling against 80 tons, they now worked against a fraction of that force. The engineers never wasted human strength when gravity could be harnessed instead. By the time the block reached the next landing platform, the sun was high, warming the stone to a pale golden hue. The team began the next phase, not lifting, not dragging, but aligning. Precision mattered here more than brute force. The stone did not simply get dropped into place. It had to be rotated, eased, nudged, and coaxed until it fitted perfectly with its neighbors. Because the integrity of the entire structure depended on the joints. Too wide, and the pyramid lost structural binding. Too tight, and microfractures could spread. So the engineers took up copper chisels, wooden mallets, and polishing stones. One worker crouched beside the block, tracing a straight line along its edge with a thin reed dipped in ink. Another used a chisel to shave off infinitesimal pieces of limestone, not chunks, but dust-like fragments. Each stroke removed less than a millimeter, and yet those millimeters mattered. On a pyramid face stretching hundreds of feet, even a few degrees of deviation could accumulate into visible misalignment. The engineers would never allow that. They checked each placement with plumb lines and leveling rods. They sighted along the edges of blocks the way a modern surveyor sights down a laser. They adjusted, waited, readjusted, polished, measured again. Their patience was not a luxury. It was the foundation of everything they built. When the block finally settled into the exact position, pressed tight against its companion stones, its top surface smoothed to match the intended incline, the overseer signaled clearance. The next team stepped forward to apply gypsum mortar. This was not glue. The ancient Egyptians were not relying on adhesive strength. Mortar compensated for microgaps and imperfections, providing a cushion that distributed load evenly. The pyramid's true strength came from weight, interlocking geometry, pressure, and friction. Mortar simply made that geometry seamless. As the work proceeded, the engineer who supervised structural stresses stood near the edge, taking note of the day's placements. He wasn't writing numbers, but mentally calculating load paths. He knew, intuitively, how each new block would distribute its weight downward. He knew that the pyramid's core needed densely packed chambers of stone, not just to fill space but to redirect compressive forces inward. He knew the outer casing had to be placed last, not first, because the core was the load-bearing engine. And he knew that the higher the pyramid rose, the lighter the stones must become. They would soon transition from enormous multi-tonnage foundation blocks to smaller, more manageable ones, not because they lacked strength, but because the upper tiers did not require the same mass. And as midday approached, the engineers began preparations for one of the most ingenious practices in the entire construction process, shifting the ramp. A continuous straight ramp from ground to apex would be impossible too large, too long, too intensive. Instead, the ramp wound around the pyramid in stages, like an ascending ribbon. Once the workers reached a new height, part of the previous ramp would be dismantled. the material carried upward using the same hauling techniques, and the ramp rebuilt at a higher tier. This cyclical recycling of mudbrick, rubble, and stone was essential. It transformed the construction into a spiraling assembly line that rose with the structure itself. To begin shifting the ramp, the lower section had to be broken down. Workers approached with stone hammers and wooden pry bars, loosening hardened clay and rolling spare blocks into transport sleds. The engineers carefully plotted where the new ramp section would attach. It needed to anchor into stable parts of the existing pyramid, not into fresh mortar still curing under the morning heat. They measured angles, surveyed load points, and marked future pathways with colored pigments. Then the laborers began carrying the reclaimed materials up in baskets or dragging them on smaller sleds to the next tier. Each cycle of dismantling and rebuilding was an iteration, another rung in the ladder of rising stone. As the afternoon light stretched long and golden across the plateau, the workers prepared for a critical phase, finishing the passage lining inside the pyramid. For as much as the outer construction demanded precision, the interior required something even more meticulous: strict geometric alignment. Inside, a corridor angled steeply upward toward what would become the king's chamber. But the chamber itself wasn't simply a room. It was a carefully engineered box meant to resist the crushing forces of millions of tons of stone pressing down from above. So while one team moved stone on the exterior, another deep within the half-completed pyramid worked on the relieving chambers, a sequence of cavities and angled granite beams designed to redirect pressure away from the central chamber. The chief architect personally oversaw this process. He ran his fingertips along the corners of the granite beams, feeling for imperfections. He tapped each surface with a polished stone hammer, listening to the tone. A clear ring meant structural integrity. A dull thud meant internal flaws. The physics behind this was basic acoustic resonance, a technique still used today to detect material consistency. Meanwhile, carpenters built wooden scaffolding inside the passages, raising platforms that would allow the workers to position each granite beam with careful control. The granite itself had arrived weeks earlier from quarries hundreds of miles away, floated down the Nile on barges designed to balance weight evenly. And now, inside the dim passageways, the beams needed to be shifted into place with levers, ropes, and coordinated human effort. It took more time to align a single granite beam in the relieving chamber than to place 20 limestone blocks outside. But this chamber was the heart of the pyramid's internal architecture. It had to be flawless. Outside, the shadow of the pyramid stretched long over the desert as the sun began its descent. The engineers gathered at the newly extended ramp, marking fresh guidelines for tomorrow's lifting sequence. They traced out the path of each block that would move, planned the rotation angles required for outer casing stones, calculated how much water would be needed to lubricate the sand tracks, and assigned teams strategically so that no group fatigued before reaching the day's quota. As twilight settled, the workers placed their tools into clay jars and wooden chests, not scattered, not abandoned. Every instrument had its place, from copper chisels to measuring rods. The more organized the tools, the more efficient the morning would begin. And as the desert cooled, the engineers took one final circuit around the structure. They checked tension in ropes left on pulleys for the next day, reinforced weak points on the ramp surface, and brushed sand away from the edges where block seams needed to remain clean. Finally, with the stars beginning to appear over the desert, the worksite dimmed into quiet once more. The wind moved gently across the plateau, carrying the scent of limestone dust. The pyramid stood half complete, but already immense, a mountain reshaped by hands guided by mathematics, intuition, and unshakable patience. The engineers knew that tomorrow the process would continue exactly where it paused. One block, one adjustment, one survey line at a time. And as the night settled over the half-finished pyramid, the last echoes of footsteps faded into the stillness. The workers had gone. The ropes slackened, the ramps rested, and the desert returned to its ancient rhythm. The engineers stepped back from the structure one final time, making mental notes of the positions, the stress points, the paths tomorrow's work would follow. The stars overhead stood like patient overseers, silent witnesses to the rising geometry of stone. And from that silence, the next day began. The first light broke gently across the horizon, not sharp or sudden, but with the slow certainty of a desert dawn. The engineers walked back onto the plateau with the same quiet familiarity as always, No one rushed. The pyramid's construction was a sequence of repeated precision, not haste. Every stone waited for its moment. Every measurement had to be taken with a steady hand. The entire structure grew the same way. A mountain grows incrementally, purposefully, one layer at a time. At the base of the pyramid, the morning routine began with inspection. The chief surveyor traced the outer edge with his leveling rod, checking the angle of incline for the casing stones that would eventually create that near-perfectly smooth exterior face. Workers had not yet begun polishing the outer limestone, but they were approaching the stage where precision mattered more than ever. The upper tiers were narrower, so deviations would be more visible. The surveyor stood back, sighting along the edges with the same practiced gaze he had used since the first tier was laid. The pyramid, even in its incomplete form, radiated an undeniable sense of order, a geometry too vast to measure at once, but too precise to question. Not far from him, another engineer walked the length of the newest ramp section. He traced the compacted clay surface with the toe of his sandal, feeling for inconsistencies. A ramp at this height did not need to be as wide as those below. The blocks themselves were smaller now, intentionally so, but stability still mattered. The engineer tapped his measuring rod into the surface and listened for changes in tone. A hollow sound indicated sand pockets beneath the clay, and those pockets could collapse under the weight of a sled. Workers stepped forward immediately, reinforcing the weak spots with fresh layers of clay, crushed limestone, and water. When the overseer signaled readiness, the first block of the day was prepared. Though smaller than the foundation stones, it still weighed several tons, far heavier than any man alone could manage. The hauling team assembled, ropes wrapped carefully around their forearms, sandals dug into the sand for traction. The overseer struck the rhythm board, and the men responded with the same steady chant that had guided thousands of lifts before this one. The desert echoed softly with their voices, not loud, not hurried, just consistent, controlled. As the sled began its ascent up the ramp, the engineers walked alongside, monitoring alignment. If the sled pulled even slightly to one side, friction would increase dramatically. If the block tilted forward, momentum might become dangerous. But the ascent went smoothly, the sled gliding over the dampened sand with a low groan, ropes tightening and relaxing in perfect rhythm with the team's steps. The counterweight system engaged midway, lifting part of the block's weight as a basket of rubble descended the opposite slope, harnessing gravity to combat gravity. That was the elegance of it. Near the landing platform, the hauling team slowed, and the engineers stepped in. This was where precision overtook brute force. The stone had to be maneuvered into position with mild pushes, careful rotations, and subtle adjustments. The workers placed wooden shims beneath its edges, then tapped them with mallets to raise or lower the block by fractions of an inch. Every sound mattered, the tone of the tap, the scrape of stone against stone, the soft grind that signaled when two surfaces met flush. Once the block was aligned, the engineers turned their attention to the interior passageways. The exterior work could continue under the supervision of the ramp team, but the interior demanded a different level of focus, a slower, more deliberate pace. Inside the pyramid, the air was cooler, still tinged with the smell of worked stone and powdered dust. The narrow corridors led upward to the relieving chambers, where the massive granite beams had already begun to form the protective shell above the king's chamber. But this was only part of the process. The engineers were now working on aligning the next sequence of beams, each one weighing many tons and shaped with astonishing accuracy. Wooden scaffolding filled the chamber, rising in a tangle of beams and planks. The workers climbed carefully, carrying ropes, levers, and copper tools. Every movement inside the chamber had to be controlled. Granite was far less forgiving than limestone. It responded poorly to sudden impact. A careless strike could cause a crack, and a cracked beam could compromise the entire chamber below. The chief architect stood at the center of the relieving chamber, his gaze tracing the granite surfaces. He didn't need drawings. He could see the geometry in his mind, how the angled beams above would channel weight outward, how the rectangular chamber below would distribute pressure evenly, how the load paths needed to overlap like a woven fabric. The Egyptians did not describe engineering with modern terms, but they understood structure with remarkable depth. Workers adjusted the scaffolding height, preparing the new beam for placement. Outside, another team guided a sled, carrying the granite beam toward the entrance passage. It had been brought up the external ramps weeks earlier, stored under shade, and now carefully maneuvered inside, using wooden rollers. The rollers were not placed beneath the beam randomly. Engineers arranged them at precisely spaced intervals, ensuring that the load remained evenly distributed. If one roller bore too much weight, it could crush under the mass, throwing the entire transport off balance. Inside the chamber, the beam was secured with ropes from multiple angles. Workers pulled, lifted, and steadied it as it rose inch by inch along the wooden supports. The air inside was filled with quiet grunts, soft instructions, and the faint creaking of tensioned rope fibers. And slowly, always slowly, the granite beam slid into its intended position. Once it rested across the supporting walls, the engineers climbed to its top surface. They checked its level with plumb lines, adjusting with wooden wedges until the stone lay perfectly horizontal. They tapped its edges and listened. A clear, ringing tone meant structural success. A duller note meant hidden imperfections. Today, the beam rang true. Satisfied, the architect moved on to the next aspect: ventilation shafts. The small, angled shafts that extended from the king's chamber to the exterior were not decorative. They served cooling and symbolic purposes, and their alignment was a task of extraordinary precision. Engineers used simple sighting tools, long straight rods, stone markers, and carefully measured angles to ensure the shafts remained straight. Even though the shafts were too narrow for a person to enter fully, workers could smooth and shape the interior surfaces using extended chisels and scraping tools. As they refined the shafts, another engineering team worked near the entrance of the ascending passageway. There, the stone plugs that would one day seal the passage were being shaped. These triangular-topped granite blocks needed to slide into place at the end of construction, creating a permanent seal. But they had to fit perfectly, snug enough to lock, smooth enough to slide. Engineers and masons worked side by side, chiseling, measuring, sanding, testing. Outside, the sun was beginning its afternoon descent, painting the western sky with soft gold. On the exterior, workers were placing the newest tier of casing stones. These stones were smoother than the core blocks, shaped into slight trapezoids to create a sloping outer face. The engineers guided their placement with even more care than usual. Casing stones were the skin of the pyramid, the part the world would see. They had to align seamlessly, creating the iconic angled surfaces that would eventually gleam in the sun. One engineer stood back from the face, sighting along the casing line. If even one stone protruded slightly, the next ones would need to compensate, creating a ripple in the surface. So each block was ground, shaved, adjusted, and fitted until the line remained perfect. Workers used abrasive sand and flat stones to polish the surfaces, removing sharp edges and shaping them subtly to match the incline. Even though the final polishing would come years later, they already took pride in how each tier looked. As the afternoon cooled, the interior and exterior teams converged at the base of the pyramid. Plans for the next day needed to be coordinated. Which blocks would move where, how many ropes needed replacing, whether ramps needed reinforcing. The chief architect made notes in the sand with a pointed stick, drawing simple diagrams of block placement. The overseers memorized their tasks. The plateau hummed with quiet preparation, and as the light shifted into dusk, the engineers walked the perimeter one last time. They checked the ropes still stretched across the ramps, making sure none were frayed. They brushed dust away from the seams of newly placed stones. They made sure the interior shafts remained free of debris. Every small task ensured that tomorrow's work would begin with clarity. Finally, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, silence returned to the construction site. The desert stretched pale and vast, the air cooling, the wind whispering over the limestone. The half-finished pyramid stood unmoving, a rising testament to patience, design, and human precision. And so, another layer of the great monument had grown, not by force, but by rhythm, mathematics, and the unbroken discipline of countless hands working in harmony. And as the last traces of twilight slipped behind the desert ridge, the pyramid stood in its half-finished state, like a silent promise. The ramps curled around it like ancient pathways of intent. The interior chambers resonated with the hush of newly placed granite, and the night wind carried the fine scent of limestone dust across the plateau. Everything waited for the next day, because each day nudged the monument closer to the moment when it would no longer be a construction project, but a finished, breath-holding marvel. And morning arrived as softly as ever. The first engineers stepped onto the plateau before the sun had fully risen. their sandals stirring faint lines in the cool sand. None of them rushed. They approached the pyramid with a familiarity earned through years of repetition, step after step, stone after stone, calculation after calculation. Even now, with the pyramid nearing its upper tiers, the work had not grown easier. If anything, the precision mattered even more. They began, as they always did, with quiet observation. One engineer walked the upper ramp, now steeper and narrower than the earlier tiers. He tapped the compacted surface with his measuring rod, listening for any weakness. Up here, even small imperfections could lead to dangerous slips. The ramp snaked upward in a gentle bend, its edges reinforced with tightly packed clay and angled blocks to prevent collapse. He crouched, running his hand across the surface. It was firm, ready for today's ascent. Meanwhile, the chief surveyor positioned himself at the edge of the pyramid's latest tier. He lowered a plumb line, watching the strings sway gently before settling into alignment with the casing stones below. The line had to fall in perfect vertical harmony with the face beneath it. This was how the Egyptians kept the pyramid's angles so breathtakingly precise, not with numbers, but with sight, gravity, and endless patience. The surveyor lifted his gaze, tracing the invisible path that would one day become a smooth white slope, rising cleanly to the apex. Around him, workers prepared the first block of the day. Though the stones placed this high were smaller, they still demanded careful orchestration. The hauling team arranged themselves along the ropes, gripping the coarse fibers with steady hands. The overseer struck the rhythm board once, twice, 3 times, and the men responded with the familiar rising chant. Their steps moved in unison, pressing into the ramp with practiced confidence. The block slid forward on its sled, guided by sand dampened just enough to reduce friction. The ramp groaned faintly under the weight, ropes straining, muscles tightening, breaths synchronized. The ascent was slow, almost meditative, a ritual repeated countless times, each repetition building another fragment of a monument meant to outlast the centuries. Halfway up, the counterweight system engaged. The basket filled with heavy rubble dropped smoothly along its chute, lifting part of the block's weight. The engineers watched the pulleys, making sure the ropes remained aligned. Even one tangled strand could disrupt the balance, but everything moved cleanly. The system had been refined countless times over the years. At the top landing, the hauling team slowed. The engineers stepped in, gestures quiet and precise. They rotated the block with levers, adjusting its path, millimeter by millimeter. Workers applied wooden shims beneath the stone, raising one side to correct its angle. They slid it forward with controlled pressure until it pressed gently against its neighboring stones. The sound of stone touching stone, muted, resonant, was familiar and satisfying. The chief mason examined the edges with his fingers, feeling for irregularities. If the seam was too wide, he marked it with pigment, and workers trimmed the surface with chisels. If the seam was too tight, they polished it slightly to ease the pressure. Even now, with thousands of stones already placed, the search for perfection had not weakened. The stones near the summit belonged to the most visible part of the pyramid. Even a slight misalignment could ripple outward, disturbing the lines that would define the entire structure. Once the outer work settled into its rhythm, the chief architect moved inside. The pyramid's interior was now almost fully formed, silent corridors stretching upward, lit only by flickers of reflected sunlight and the occasional oil lamp. The granite beams in the relieving chambers rested exactly where they should, angled to distribute the unimaginable weight above. The workers had begun polishing the inner surfaces of the grand gallery, smoothing the passage that would guide the sarcophagus downward during the burial. They were now focusing on the final adjustments to the ventilation shafts. Narrow, precise, angled, these shafts extended like thin arteries through the otherwise solid stone. Their alignment needed to be exact. If they veered even slightly, they could pierce the outer casing at a weak point or create structural irregularities. So the engineers sighted through them using polished copper mirrors that reflected slivers of sunlight deep into the narrow channels. The mirrors helped them detect bends, tiny protrusions, unwanted curves. Workers then inserted long chisels, scraping away imperfections from within. In the king's chamber itself, the massive granite sarcophagus shell, undecorated, rough-edged, and unfinished, waited in its place. It had been brought in early, long before the upper tiers were closed. It was carved from a single piece of Aswan granite, so dense that modern diamond tools would struggle with it. The ancient craftsmen had shaped it through abrasion, rubbing granite against granite, pouring sand between surfaces as grinding material. Hours of labor for every inch. Workers continued smoothing the exterior, their motions steady and rhythmic. They worked not for ornamentation, this was not a showpiece, but to remove any sharp edges that could crack under load. The chamber's geometry depended on even distribution. Above them, in the high triangle of relieving chambers, the air was still and heavy. The beams lay in perfect layered formation, flat granite, angled granite, flat granite, repeating until the engineers were satisfied that the chamber could endure millennia of pressure. Back outside, the sun rose higher. The upper tiers demanded the most careful work of all. The pyramid narrowed steeply now, so space for hauling was limited. Engineers directed the team to shift the ramp once more, dismantling the lower curve and rebuilding it higher. Workers removed blocks from the earlier section, carrying them upward on sleds. The ramp crept around the pyramid in a spiral, rising at a slight angle so the hauling teams always had enough room. While workers rebuilt the ramp, another team began setting the earliest casing stones near the top. These stones were special. They would define the final visual angle of the pyramid. Each casing block was polished more than the lower ones, edges shaped to join at perfectly reflective surfaces. Engineers used plumb lines and straight sighting rods to verify alignment. The wind whistled softly along the ascending face as workers sanded and polished. By midday, the heat intensified. Stone absorbed sunlight, warming the air near the pyramid's surface. Workers paused in the shade of the structure to drink water and moisten headcloths. Even the engineers rested briefly, sitting near the base and reviewing the next sequence of block placements. When work resumed, a critical task began, lifting the capstones, base stones, the highest structural blocks before the very peak. These were smaller, but they had to be perfectly shaped. The top of the pyramid was not a flat platform. It narrowed almost to a point. So these blocks required angled cuts, tighter joints, and extreme accuracy. The hauling up here was gentler, almost ceremonial. Ropes strained against the incline, but the blocks slid smoothly, aided by carefully placed sand and well-timed pulls. Workers breathed in unison, the chant softer than usual. The engineers watched with intense focus. One misstep could send a block tumbling. When the blocks reached their position, the engineers rotated them into place slowly. The final meters of height demanded an almost sculptural precision. They shaved stone surfaces until seams were so tight that even a red leaf would not slip between them. Inside, the final adjustments continued. The grand gallery's corbelled ceiling shimmered slightly in the dusty light as workers smoothed each step-side block. The ascending passage was cleared of debris. The final stone plugs were inspected, their surfaces polished and ready for the day they would slide into place, sealing the inner chambers. As afternoon deepened toward evening, the engineers gathered near the upper tiers, reviewing the capstone's design. The very top of the pyramid would receive a small, specially shaped stone, possibly coated in electrum, possibly left as polished limestone, depending on tradition and available materials. But the engineers already knew what mattered most. The capstone had to lock the final geometry, completing the stable angle of all four triangular faces. The measurements were made in silence as the wind brushed past their linen garments. Workers prepared the platform. They laid the final upper blocks and fitted them into place with careful taps. The pyramid, though still rough on its outer surface, now stood in its full height, the final shape emerging like a sculpted mountain from centuries of wind-carved desert. At dusk, the hauling team brought the capstone up the narrowest ramp, the ropes creaking quietly. The block was small compared to those below, yet symbolically immense. Engineers directed its placement with gestures more than words. The block rose, tilted, rotated, and finally settled into the heart of the summit. A silence followed. Workers stepped back. Engineers looked up at the structure with quiet satisfaction. The shape was complete. The pyramid stood whole, though still awaiting its final polishing and ceremonial rituals. The night breeze drifted across the plateau as workers collected tools and extinguished oil lamps. The engineers made their final walk around the base, checking seams, ramps, alignments. Every corner of the monument felt different now, not a worksite, but something finished, timeless. When the stars emerged, cold and brilliant over the desert, the pyramid seemed to rise into them like an extension of the sky itself. Its faces caught the faint moonlight, edges sharp, angles perfect. It no longer felt like something being built. It felt eternal. And so the Great Pyramid stood, completed through mathematics, intuition, muscle, patience, and the unbroken labor of countless hands working in harmony. The engineers exhaled into the quiet, knowing their work would outlast their names, their lifetimes, and perhaps even their world. And the desert, vast and ancient, accepted the monument into its silence.